What if I told you that the most effective way to hide the truth isn't to bury it in classified vaults, but to scatter it among thousands of lies? What if the greatest conspiracy of our time is hiding in plain sight, disguised as entertainment for millions of readers worldwide? Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to thank River Ajaviri for suggesting this topic. It's exactly the kind of mind-bending investigation that keeps me awake at night. And if you have ideas for future videos, drop them in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Sleep Theories if you enjoy these deep dives into the unknown. Tonight, we're exploring a theory that will fundamentally change how you view online fiction, government secrecy, and the very nature of truth itself. This is the story of one digital archivist who stumbled upon evidence that the SCP Foundation, a collaborative fiction project read by millions, might be the most sophisticated disinformation campaign ever conceived. I never believed in secret societies or shadow agencies, at least not the kind you'd find buried in Reddit threads at 3 in the morning, written by users with names like Truthseeker 2024 and Deep State Watcher. My world was refreshingly ordinary. Digital archiving for a mid-tier university in Ohio. Most of my days were spent migrating ancient files from dying servers, cleaning metadata that hadn't been touched since the Clinton administration, and flagging corrupted PDFs that some professor desperately needed for their tenure review. The work was tedious but honest. I'd arrive at 8 AM with my coffee, settle into my cubicle in the basement of the library, and lose myself in the digital archaeology of academic bureaucracy. Personnel files from the 1970s, research proposals that never got funding, correspondence between departments that had been merged and dissolved decades ago. It was the kind of job that attracted people who found comfort in order and making sense of chaos one file at a time. My colleague Janet used to joke that I was single-handedly preserving the university's ability to bore future historians to death. She wasn't wrong. Most of what I processed was spectacularly mundane. Budget reports, meeting minutes, purchase orders for equipment that was already obsolete when it was new. The kind of documents that would make even the most dedicated researcher's eyes glaze over. But that mundane routine is exactly what made me the perfect person to notice when something didn't belong. When you spend years wading through the predictable bureaucracy of academic administration, anomalies stick out like neon signs in a library reading room. The project that changed everything came through our department in late September. A defence contractor that had folded in the 1990s was finally donating their archives to the university. Most of it was Cold War-era material, missile guidance systems that were cutting edge in 1962, nutrition studies for soldiers deployed in hostile environments, psychological evaluations for personnel working on classified projects, standard military-industrial complex paperwork that had been gathering dust in a warehouse for 30 years. The contractor had worked on everything from early computer systems to experimental aircraft designs. Their archives were massive, over 50,000 documents spanning 4 decades of government contracts. It was exactly the kind of comprehensive historical collection that would take me months to properly catalogue and digitise. I approached it like any other large-scale archival project, systematically, methodically, one box at a time. I started with the earliest materials, working chronologically through the decades. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect from a defence contractor of that era. Technical manuals thick with jargon that was incomprehensible to anyone outside the field, correspondence with Pentagon officials, progress reports on projects with names that sounded like rejected Star Wars planets. I actually laughed out loud when I saw it. Anyone who's spent enough time in certain corners of the internet knows about SCP. It's one of the most successful collaborative fiction projects ever created. A wiki filled with thousands of entries describing anomalous objects, entities and phenomena that a fictional organisation called the SCP Foundation supposedly contains and studies. The entries are written in a clinical scientific style that mimics real classified documents, complete with redacted information, containment protocols, and incident reports. It's brilliant horror fiction, really. The clinical tone makes everything more unsettling. Instead of describing a monster that tears people apart, an SCP entry might clinically note that exposure to SCP-XXX results in rapid cellular degradation, or subjects experience acute psychological distress followed by cessation of vital functions. The bureaucratic language somehow makes the horrors more real, more immediate. But this wasn't a printout from the SCP Wiki. This was a genuine government document, complete with classification stamps, distribution codes, and physical signatures from real military personnel. The paper had the distinctive feel of 1960s government printing, slightly rough, with that particular shade of off-white that comes from decades-old pulp. The classification stamps were embossed rather than printed, and the signatures had the slightly faded look of real ink that had been sitting in a file cabinet for 50 years. I checked the document against the SCP Wiki entries I was familiar with. The format was identical. The clinical tone, the numbered classification system, the specific terminology for containment procedures. But this document was dated March 15th, 1967. The SCP Wiki wasn't created until 2008. The document itself was unlike any SCP entry I'd read online. Instead of describing some impossible creature or cursed object, it dealt with something far more subtle and deeply unsettling. An entire town that had been quietly erased from existence. According to the official record, the town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, had been evacuated in August 1957 due to groundwater contamination from a nearby chemical plant. The evacuation was supposedly temporary, but the town was never reoccupied. Maps from the late 1950s showed it clearly, but by the 1960s, it had vanished from cartographic records entirely. The official explanation was environmental remediation. The contamination had been so severe that the entire area was deemed permanently uninhabitable. But the SCP document told a different story entirely. SCP-3847 is a geographical anomaly affecting the former township of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, the document began. The phenomenon manifests as temporal repetition loops within the local population. Affected subjects relive identical 72-hour cycles with complete retention of the memories from previous iterations, but apparent inability to alter outcomes through conscious intervention. The clinical language continued for several pages, describing how residents of the town had become trapped in a 3-day loop, experiencing the same events over and over with full awareness of their situation but unable to break free. The document noted that the phenomenon appeared to be localized to individuals who had been present in the town during the initial manifestation event on August 12, 1957. What made it even more disturbing was the containment protocol. The anomaly is effectively self-containing due to the temporal isolation of affected subjects. However, exposure of external observers to SCP-3847 results in immediate collapse of the phenomenon and termination of all affected subjects. Current containment consists of maintaining the official cover story of environmental contamination and preventing civilian access to the affected area. The implications were staggering. According to this document, an entire town of people had been trapped in a temporal loop for over a decade, reliving the same 3 days endlessly, and the only way to free them would kill them instantly. The document was signed by 3 military officials whose names I was able to verify through historical records. Colonel Marcus Webb, who had worked on Project Blue Book and other government investigations into unusual phenomena. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwood, a psychiatrist who had consulted on experimental interrogation techniques for the CIA, and Director James Morrison, whose signature appeared on dozens of classified documents related to psychological warfare research. These were real people, with verifiable histories and documented involvement in legitimate government projects. Their signatures weren't forged. I compared them against other documents in the archive and found perfect matches in the pen pressure, letter formation, and subtle quirks that are nearly impossible to replicate. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the document, about the impossible implications of what I'd found. So I did what any reasonable person would do in the digital age. I started researching. I began by looking up everything I could find about Millbrook, Pennsylvania. The official records were exactly as the SCP document had described. A small town evacuated due to chemical contamination, never reoccupied, eventually removed from maps and forgotten. But when I dug deeper into newspaper archives and local historical societies, I found hints of something stranger. A reporter from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette had visited the area in 1959 2 years after the supposed evacuation. His article, buried in the back pages of the Sunday edition, described finding the town completely intact but eerily empty. It was as if everyone had simply vanished mid-conversation, he wrote. I found a diner with food still on the plates, a barbershop with hair scattered around an empty chair, a school with lessons still written on the blackboards, but no people anywhere. But what really caught my attention was a small detail in the article. The reporter mentioned seeing the same car drive past 3 times during his brief visit, always at exactly 2:47 p.m, always with the same elderly man behind the wheel. He noted it as curious but didn't seem to grasp the significance. That detail, the repetition, the precise timing, matched exactly with what the SCP document had described about the temporal loops. I started comparing other SCP entries with real-world events, looking for similar patterns. What I found made me question everything I thought I knew about the line between fiction and reality. SCP-1562, described on the wiki as an incendiary humanoid entity, matched almost perfectly with reports from a chemical plant explosion in West Virginia in 1974. The official investigation had concluded that faulty equipment caused the blast, but several witness testimonies described seeing a figure walking through the flames, apparently unharmed by temperatures that should have been instantly fatal. SCP-2821, listed as a contagious laughter phenomenon, corresponded to the Tanganyika laughter epidemic of 1962, an actual historical event where over 1,000 people in Tanzania were affected by an outbreak of uncontrollable laughter that lasted for months. The official explanation was mass hysteria, but several contemporary accounts described the laughter as having an almost supernatural quality, spreading instantly through communities with no apparent vector of transmission. SCP-4445, described as a Euclid-class artifact recovered from Vatican archives, aligned with references I found in theological journals to a mysterious object that had been quietly removed from public display at St. Peter's Basilica in 1978. The official reason given was conservation concerns, but internal Vatican correspondence hinted at more serious issues, visitors reporting strange visions, electronic equipment failing in the object's presence, and at least one incident of what was described as spontaneous stigmata in a tourist who had touched the display case. The more I researched, the more the pattern became clear. For every SCP entry I investigated, I could find traces of similar real-world events. Some required deeper digging, cross-referencing obscure news reports with military records, or tracing personnel files through multiple agencies, but the connections were always there. After weeks of research, a terrifying possibility began to crystallize in my mind. What if the SCP Foundation wiki wasn't original fiction at all? What if it was something far more insidious? A massive disinformation campaign designed to hide real anomalous events in plain sight. The logic was frighteningly elegant. If you're a government agency dealing with genuinely inexplicable phenomena, objects that defy known physics, events that challenge our understanding of reality itself, how do you keep them secret in the age of information? Traditional classification only goes so far. Someone always leaks, someone always talks, someone always discovers what they're not supposed to know. But what if you could control the leak? What if, instead of trying to suppress information, you could flood the market with disinformation? Create thousands of fake SCP entries for every real one, train the public to view the entire concept as entertaining fiction. Then, when the real files inevitably surface, no one would believe them. They'd just assume it was more of the same collaborative storytelling. It was brilliant in its simplicity. The SCP Wiki had over 6,000 entries and millions of readers worldwide. If even 1% of those entries were based on real classified files, that would still mean dozens of genuine anomalies were hiding among the fiction. And because the fictional entries were so well crafted, so detailed and convincing, they provided perfect camouflage for any real documents that might surface. Think about it. If you found a classified document describing an impossible creature or a reality-bending artifact, what would be your first thought? You'd assume it was either fake or part of the SCP fiction universe. You might even appreciate the quality of the writing or the cleverness of the concept. But you almost certainly wouldn't consider the possibility that it might be real. The collaborative nature of the wiki made the camouflage even more effective. Anyone could contribute entries, which meant that real government files could be uploaded by intelligence operatives posing as fiction writers. They could dump genuine classified information directly onto the wiki, confident that it would be treated as creative writing rather than leaked intelligence. I began approaching the SCP wiki like an archaeological site, looking for entries that had the subtle markers of genuine government documentation. Real classified files have a particular style and structure that's difficult to replicate perfectly. They use specific terminology, follow established formatting protocols, and often contain bureaucratic quirks that fiction writers wouldn't think to include. I started by looking for entries that deviated slightly from the standard SCP format in ways that matched actual government document structures. Real classified files often include distribution lists, reference numbers that correspond to other documents, and administrative notes that have nothing to do with the main content but everything to do with bureaucratic procedure. SCP-2426 caught my attention immediately, ostensibly about a memetic hazard that affected people who read about it. The entry was written in a format that perfectly matched CIA briefing documents from the 1970s. More importantly, it contained specific reference numbers that, when researched, led to genuine intelligence documents related to psychological warfare research. SCP-3999 appeared to be a meta-commentary on the SCP format itself, but embedded within its seemingly postmodern structure were technical specifications that matched exactly with experimental electromagnetic research conducted at a military facility in Nevada during the 1980s. The numbers weren't random. They corresponded to actual frequency measurements and power outputs from classified experiments. SCP-5555 looked like pure fiction, describing an impossible mathematical concept that supposedly broke reality when calculated. But the mathematical notation it used was legitimate and extremely advanced, far beyond what most fiction writers would be capable of creating. When I had a mathematician friend analyse the formulas, she told me they were based on cutting-edge theoretical physics that had only been published in highly specialised academic journals. The more I analysed these entries, the more convinced I became that they weren't fiction at all. They were real classified documents, uploaded to the wiki and disguised as creative writing. The SCP community had become unwitting accomplices in the largest intelligence operation in history, helping to hide genuine state secrets by treating them as entertainment. My research had been purely academic up to that point, a fascinating intellectual puzzle with no real-world consequences. But that changed when I made the mistake of going public with my theories. I created a throwaway Reddit account and posted a detailed analysis of my findings to several conspiracy theory subreddits. I was careful not to use any real names or specific details that could compromise ongoing operations, but I laid out the basic framework of my theory that the SCP wiki was being used to hide real classified information among fictional entries. The response was exactly what I expected from Reddit. Most users dismissed my theory as an elaborate fiction itself, praising my creativity while making it clear they didn't take any of it seriously. A few users seemed intrigued and asked for more details, but overall the reception was lukewarm. But 3 days after my post, I received a direct message that changed everything. The account was only hours old, with no post history and a randomly generated username. The message was brief but terrifying in its implications. Stop cross-referencing the entries. You're not supposed to connect them. The wiki is the containment. I stared at the message for several minutes, trying to process its meaning. Whoever had sent it knew exactly what I was doing, despite the fact that I'd been careful not to reveal specific details about my research methods. They knew I was comparing SCP entries to real-world events, looking for patterns and connections that weren't supposed to be found. Before I could respond, another message appeared. Think about it. If the public stumbles onto real files, what's the best way to neutralize the threat? You don't hide them. You bury them under thousands of fake ones. The SCP Foundation isn't real. It's camouflage, but the anomalies are. The second message confirmed my worst fears while simultaneously providing a terrifying new perspective. The sender wasn't trying to debunk my theory. They were confirming it while warning me to stop investigating. The implication was clear. I had stumbled onto something real, something dangerous, and continuing to investigate would have consequences. I tried to respond, typing and deleting several messages as I struggled to find the right words. Should I ask for more information? Demand proof? Pretend I didn't understand the implications? But when I finally worked up the courage to send a response, I discovered that the account had been deleted. The messages remained in my inbox, but clicking on the username led to a user not found error. Whoever had contacted me had vanished as quickly as they'd appeared, leaving behind only those 2 chilling messages and the growing certainty that I was in over my head. Despite the warning, or perhaps because of it, I found myself unable to stop investigating. The contact had confirmed what I'd already suspected, but it had also raised new questions. How extensive was this operation? How long had it been running? And most importantly, what kind of anomalies were they hiding? I began focusing on SCP entries that had been posted by accounts with minimal activity, users who had contributed only 1 or 2 entries before disappearing from the community entirely. These one-shot contributors were more likely to be intelligence operatives dumping classified information, rather than genuine fiction writers building a body of work. What I found was deeply disturbing. Many of these single contribution entries described phenomena that corresponded to real-world events that had been officially explained away or covered up. Unexplained mass disappearances, technological failures that defied known physics, psychological effects that suggested mind control or memory manipulation. SCP-6771, contributed by a user who posted only that single entry, described a cognitive hazard that caused people to forget specific events or individuals. The clinical description matched perfectly with reports I found in declassified MKUltra documents about experimental memory modification techniques. The entry even included technical details about neural pathway disruption that corresponded to legitimate neuroscience research from the 1970s. SCP-7123 described a temporal displacement device that could shift objects slightly forward or backward in time. The user who posted it had no other contributions and hadn't been active on the wiki for over 3 years, but the technical specifications in the entry matched exactly with theoretical research being conducted at CERN on temporal mechanics. More disturbing, the entry described specific safety protocols that weren't publicly available, but corresponded to internal safety guidelines I found referenced in leaked scientific correspondence. SCP-8456 appeared to be pure science fiction, describing a device that could manipulate probability itself. But embedded within the narrative were mathematical formulas that, according to my physicist friend, represented cutting-edge quantum mechanical research that was years ahead of publicly available knowledge. The entry had been posted by an account that was created specifically to upload that single SCP, then never used again. The pattern was consistent and deeply unsettling. Real classified research was being hidden among fictional entries, protected by the assumption that everything on the wiki was creative writing. Any scientist who recognised the legitimate research would likely assume it was coincidence, or that the fiction writer had done excellent research. The perfect crime, stealing classified information by making it too unbelievable to be taken seriously. To understand the scope of what I was uncovering, I began researching the history of government disinformation campaigns. What I discovered was that using fiction to hide truth was a well-established intelligence technique with roots going back decades. During World War II, the British government had used fake movie productions to hide real military operations. During the Cold War, the CIA had funded science fiction writers to create stories that would discredit legitimate UFO sightings by associating them with obvious fiction. The agency had even used comic books and novels to spread disinformation about their actual capabilities, while making their real operations seem like fantasy. But the SCP operation was more sophisticated than anything that had come before. Instead of simply funding fiction writers to create disinformation, they had weaponized collaborative creativity itself. By creating a community where anyone could contribute, they had provided themselves with the perfect cover for dumping classified information. Real intelligence operatives could hide among thousands of legitimate fiction writers, their contributions indistinguishable from creative writing. The timing also made sense. The SCP Wiki had been created in 2008, right around the time when government transparency was becoming a major issue. WikiLeaks was gaining prominence, Edward Snowden was still years away from his revelations, but there was growing pressure for government accountability. intelligence agencies needed a new approach to information control, something that could handle the reality of a world where secrets inevitably leaked. By 2008, the internet had already demonstrated its power to expose government secrets. Traditional classification wasn't enough anymore. But what if you could control not just the classification, but the interpretation? What if you could make the truth seem like fiction before anyone had a chance to believe it? The SCP Wiki provided the perfect solution. A community-driven project with millions of readers worldwide, dedicated to creating realistic-sounding fiction about impossible things. The perfect place to hide real impossible things among the fake ones. Months into my investigation, I finally found the validation I'd been looking for, and it was more terrifying than I'd imagined. While researching personnel files for the defense contractor whose archives had started my investigation, I discovered something that made everything click into place. Among the employees who had worked on classified projects during the 1960s and 1970s, I found the name Dr. Frederick Holt, a psychologist who had specialized in unconventional warfare applications and narrative-based disinformation strategies. Dr. Holt's professional history was fascinating and disturbing. He had worked on early internet protocols during the 1980s, focusing on how online communities formed and shared information. His research had been funded through a series of grants from agencies with innocuous names that, when traced back, led to intelligence community funding sources. But what made my blood run cold was finding Dr. Holt's name in the early administrative records of the SCP Wiki. He had been one of the original administrators, listed under a pseudonym but identifiable through writing style analysis and biographical details that matched his real-world history. He had helped establish the site's formatting standards, contribution guidelines, and quality control processes. Dr. Frederick Holt, a government-funded specialist in narrative disinformation, had been instrumental in creating the structure that made the SCP Wiki perfect for hiding real classified documents among fictional ones. Further research revealed that at least 6 other early SCP administrators had connections to intelligence agencies or defense contractors. They weren't necessarily active operatives, but they were people with the knowledge and access needed to understand how classified information could be disguised as fiction. The SCP Foundation wasn't just being used to hide government secrets, it had been designed for that purpose from the beginning. Understanding the historical context made the current situation even more chilling. If my theory was correct, then the SCP Wiki had become the most successful intelligence operation in history. Millions of people worldwide were reading, sharing, and discussing classified government documents, completely unaware that some of what they were treating as entertainment might be real. But the implications went far beyond simple information hiding. If genuine anomalous phenomena were being documented in the SCP Wiki, disguised as fiction, then the public was being systematically prevented from understanding the true nature of reality. We were being kept in the dark about discoveries that could revolutionize science, technology, and our understanding of the universe itself. Consider the possibilities. What if some of the fictional SCP entities were real organisms that challenged our understanding of biology? What if the impossible technologies described in certain entries were genuine breakthroughs that could solve energy crises or enable space travel? What if the psychological effects described in various SCPs were real phenomena that could help us understand consciousness and mental health? By hiding this information among fiction, intelligence agencies weren't just keeping secrets, they were actively retarding human progress. Legitimate researchers were being prevented from studying phenomena that could benefit all humanity, simply because those phenomena were classified or inconvenient to acknowledge. The social control implications were equally disturbing. If the government could hide truth among fiction so effectively, what else might they be concealing? How much of what we consider conspiracy theory might actually be leaked truth that's been successfully discredited through association with obviously false information? The SCP operation had created a perfect system of social control through entertainment. People were voluntarily participating in their own disinformation, enthusiastically consuming and sharing material that kept them from understanding the real world around them. As I write this account, the SCP Wiki continues to grow. New entries are added daily by contributors from around the world, each one indistinguishable from the others, in terms of quality and presentation. The community has developed sophisticated rating systems, editorial processes, and creative standards that ensure a consistently high level of fictional content. But now I can't read any of it without wondering which entries are fiction and which are redacted truths that slipped through the cracks of classification. The beauty of the system is its self-reinforcing nature. The better the fictional content becomes, the more effectively it camouflages any real information that might be hidden among it. The more seriously the community takes its creative work, the less likely anyone is to consider that some of it might not be creative at all. I've tried to identify specific entries that I believe are genuine classified documents, but the task is nearly impossible without access to the original files. The best fiction is indistinguishable from reality, and the best disinformation is indistinguishable from fiction. The line between truth and lies has been blurred beyond recognition. What I can say with certainty is that the patterns are real. Too many SCP entries correspond too closely to real-world events for it to be coincidence. Too many contributors have vanished after posting single entries that contain technical information beyond their apparent expertise. Too many administrative decisions have been made by people with documented connections to intelligence agencies. The SCP Foundation, as described in the fiction, doesn't exist. There's no massive secret organisation containing anomalous objects in underground facilities around the world. But something does exist. A real system for managing genuinely anomalous phenomena, disguised so effectively that millions of people help maintain its secrecy without ever knowing they're doing it. Months have passed since I first found that document in the defence contractor's archives. I've completed the digitisation project and moved on to other work, but I can't stop thinking about what I discovered. Every time I encounter a story that seems too strange to be true, or a conspiracy theory that sounds just plausible enough to be real, I wonder, is this another example of truth disguised as fiction? The most disturbing realization is that I can never know for sure. The system is too perfect, the camouflage too complete. Even if I found definitive proof that specific SCP entries were real classified documents, who would believe me? The entire premise sounds like exactly the kind of elaborate fiction that the SCP community is famous for creating. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the greatest conspiracy is the one that makes itself impossible to prove by making the truth indistinguishable from paranoid fantasy. Maybe the most effective way to hide something isn't to deny it exists, but to make it seem so ridiculous that no one would consider taking it seriously. Every night I find myself scrolling through the SCP wiki, reading entries about impossible creatures and reality-bending artifacts. Some of them are obviously fiction, too creative, too perfect, too much like stories rather than reports. But others have that clinical precision, those bureaucratic quirks, those technical details that suggest they might be something more than creative writing. Which ones are stories, and which ones are redacted truths, slipped into the flood so quietly we'll never separate them? Maybe the SCP Foundation doesn't exist, but the things it claims to contain might be real, and if they are, then we're all participants in the greatest cover-up in human history. A cover-up disguised as entertainment, hidden in plain sight among millions of words of collaborative fiction. The truth is out there, scattered among the lies. We just can't tell which is which anymore, and perhaps that's exactly how they wanted it. My investigation took on new urgency after the mysterious contact. I realised I needed to be more systematic, more careful, but also more thorough. If I was going to uncover the truth, I needed to approach this like a proper intelligence analysis rather than casual research. I started by creating a comprehensive database of every SCP entry that showed signs of being genuine classified material. Using a secure, encrypted system I'd learned to set up during my years in digital archiving, I began cataloguing patterns, cross-references and connections that went far beyond what I'd initially discovered. The results were staggering. Out of over 6,000 entries on the SCP Wiki, I identified at least 347 that showed clear signs of being based on real classified documents. They weren't evenly distributed across the timeline. There were clusters that corresponded to specific historical periods when major intelligence operations were known to have been active. The largest cluster occurred between 2011 and 2013, right after the WikiLeaks releases had made traditional classification methods seem inadequate. During that period, over 80 suspicious entries were uploaded by accounts that showed the telltale signs of intelligence operatives: minimal community interaction, technical expertise beyond what their profiles suggested, and writing styles that matched government documentation rather than creative fiction. But what really caught my attention was a pattern in the classification numbers. Real SCP entries used a numbering system that, when properly decoded, corresponded to actual military project codes from various decades. SCP-2847 aligned with Project Bluebird, the CIA's predecessor to MK-Ultra. SCP-3961 matched the code structure used for psychological warfare experiments conducted at Fort Bragg in the 1970s. SCP-4782 corresponded to a naval intelligence project focused on acoustic weaponry. The deeper I dug, the more I realized this wasn't just about hiding individual anomalies. It was about concealing an entire shadow history of government research into phenomena that challenged our understanding of reality itself. My breakthrough came when I decided to investigate Dr. Elizabeth Blackwood more thoroughly. Her signature on the original Millbrook document had been authentic, but I wanted to understand her full role in whatever organisation was responsible for these operations. Dr. Blackwood had a fascinating career trajectory that seemed designed to give her exposure to the most unusual aspects of government research. After completing her psychiatric training at Johns Hopkins in 1959, she had immediately been recruited by the CIA for consultation on unconventional interrogation methods. Her personnel file, which I found buried in declassified MK-Ultra documents, showed that she'd been involved in experiments involving sensory deprivation, psychoactive compounds, and what was euphemistically termed reality dissociation techniques. But in 1963, she'd suddenly transferred to a different program, one that wasn't mentioned in any of the declassified materials. Her salary had doubled, her security clearance had been upgraded to a level I'd never seen before, and she'd begun travelling frequently to locations that didn't appear on any official itineraries. The trail seemed to go cold until I found a reference to her in an unlikely place: the acknowledgements section of a 1971 academic paper on anomalous psychological phenomena in isolated populations. The paper had been published in an obscure psychiatric journal that folded in 1974, but I was able to track down a copy through an interlibrary loan. The paper was ostensibly about psychological effects observed in Antarctic research stations, but reading between the lines revealed something much more interesting. The authors described instances of shared hallucinations, telepathic communication between isolated individuals, and cases where researchers seemed to develop precognitive abilities after extended exposure to unique environmental conditions. Dr. Blackwood was thanked for her invaluable consultation on containment protocols for subjects experiencing anomalous psychological phenomena. The terminology was identical to what I'd seen in the SCP documents. Following this thread led me to discover an entire network of researchers who had been involved in studying what could only be described as genuinely paranormal phenomena. They weren't crackpots or conspiracy theorists. They were respected academics and military personnel who had encountered things that challenged their understanding of reality, and had been recruited to study them systematically. One name that kept appearing in connection with Dr. Blackwood was Colonel Thomas Ashford, a military psychologist who had specialised in battlefield stress reactions during the Vietnam War. His official record was impressive but unremarkable, until I found a classified after-action report from an incident in Riverside, California, in 1969. According to the report, Colonel Ashford had been called in to investigate what was described as a mass psychological event at a local high school. Over 200 students and faculty members had simultaneously experienced what they described as temporal displacement. They claimed to have witnessed events from different time periods overlapping with the present moment. The official explanation was mass hysteria triggered by a gas leak from a nearby chemical plant. But Colonel Ashford's classified report told a very different story. He described interviewing dozens of witnesses who provided consistent, detailed accounts of seeing the school building in different states of construction and decay, interacting with people from different decades, and experiencing what he termed chronological nonlinearity. Most disturbing was his conclusion: the affected individuals are not experiencing hallucinations or psychological breaks. They are reporting genuine sensory experiences of temporal anomalies. Recommend immediate containment and cover story implementation. The report was co-signed by Dr. Elizabeth Blackwood and included detailed protocols for memory modification and narrative replacement therapy. The language and procedures matched exactly with what I'd seen in the SCP documents about memetic hazards and cognitive restructuring. I was able to track down newspaper accounts of the Riverside incident, and they followed the expected pattern. Initial reports of strange occurrences were quickly replaced by stories about the gas leak, and within weeks the entire event had been forgotten by everyone except the people who had directly experienced it. But some of those people had never forgotten. Through online forums and social media, I was able to locate several individuals who had been students at the school in 1969. Their accounts, shared decades after the event, were remarkably consistent and deeply disturbing. Martha Hendricks, who had been a senior at the time, described seeing her classroom fill with students wearing 1950s clothing, then watching as the walls aged and crumbled around her, before returning to normal. "I know it sounds crazy," she posted in a forum dedicated to unexplained experiences, "but I wasn't the only one who saw it. Over half the school witnessed the same things." Robert Martinez, a former football player, described running through hallways that seemed to stretch infinitely in both directions, encountering versions of himself at different ages. "The doctors said it was mass hysteria," he wrote, "but I know what I experienced. It was real in a way that's impossible to explain. These weren't false memories or psychological after effects. They were first-hand accounts of experiencing something that defied explanation, then being systematically convinced that it hadn't really happened." The Riverside incident became my Rosetta Stone for understanding the broader pattern. Using the names and dates from Colonel Ashford's report, I was able to trace connections to dozens of other incidents that had been officially explained away but bore the hallmarks of genuine anomalous phenomena. A chemical spill in Portland, Oregon, in 1974 that had caused temporary evacuation of the entire neighbourhood, but witness accounts described seeing buildings and landscapes that didn't match the known geography of the area. A mass food poisoning event at a corporate retreat in Colorado in 1978, where attendees reported shared dreams and telepathic experiences that persisted for weeks after the event. A gas leak at a research facility in New Mexico in 1981 that had caused hallucinations, but the hallucinations had included accurate descriptions of classified experiments being conducted in other parts of the facility. In each case, the official explanation was mundane and plausible. In each case, the classified reports told a very different story, and in each case the same small group of specialists had been brought in to manage the containment and narrative modification. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwood's name appeared in reports from over 30 separate incidents spanning 3 decades. Colonel Thomas Ashford had been involved in at least 25 cases. A psychiatrist named Dr. Michael Sterling had consulted on anomalous cases in 12 different states. A physicist named Dr. Jennifer Walsh had provided technical analysis for incidents involving impossible technologies or violations of known physical laws. This wasn't a loose collection of researchers studying strange phenomena. It was a coordinated organisation with standardised procedures, consistent terminology, and systematic approaches to containment and cover-up. Dr. Michael Sterling proved to be the key to understanding the organisational structure of what I was beginning to think of as the real SCP Foundation. Unlike Dr. Blackwood and Colonel Ashford, whose careers had been primarily military and government, Dr. Sterling had maintained a public academic position throughout his involvement with anomalous research. He was a professor of abnormal psychology at Columbia University from 1965 to 1992, with a public research focus on dissociative disorders and multiple personality syndrome. But his classified work told a very different story. I found references to Dr. Sterling in over 40 classified documents spanning nearly 3 decades. His specialty seemed to be developing therapeutic techniques for people who had been exposed to anomalous psychological phenomena, essentially helping witnesses of impossible events cope with the cognitive dissonance of their experiences. But what made Dr. Sterling's work particularly disturbing was his involvement in what appeared to be offensive applications of anomalous phenomena. Several classified reports described his research into induced dissociative states and controlled reality displacement experiences that suggested he wasn't just studying these phenomena, he was learning to weaponize them. A 1973 report described experiments where subjects were exposed to controlled temporal displacement events and then monitored to see how the experience affected their perception of reality. A 1977 document outlined procedures for using localized space-time distortions as interrogation techniques. A 1983 memo discussed the potential for selective memory modification through exposure to chronological inconsistencies. The implications were staggering. If Dr. Sterling's research was legitimate, then the government had not only discovered genuine anomalous phenomena, they had figured out how to use them as weapons and tools of social control. Dr. Jennifer Walsh represented a different aspect of the organisation, the technical and scientific analysis of phenomena that violated known physical laws. Her background was in theoretical physics, with advanced degrees from MIT and Caltech, but her career had taken some unusual turns that made sense only in the context of anomalous research. After completing her doctorate in 1968, Dr. Walsh had briefly worked for NASA on the Apollo program, focusing on radiation shielding and life support systems. But in 1970, she had suddenly transferred to a Department of Defense project with a classification level so high that even its name remained redacted in all the documents I could find. Her work seemed to focus on developing mathematical models for phenomena that shouldn't have been possible according to conventional physics. I found fragments of her research in various classified reports, always as technical appendices or supporting documentation, never as the main focus of the documents. From a 1974 report on the Riverside incident, Dr. Walsh's analysis of the temporal displacement equations indicates a localized disruption in space-time geometry consistent with exposure to exotic matter concentrations. From a 1979 investigation of anomalous electromagnetic effects, Walsh coefficient calculations suggest the presence of materials with negative mass-energy properties, potentially indicating extra-dimensional origin. From a 1985 study of impossible biological specimens, Dr. Walsh's genetic stability models indicate that the observed organisms utilize non-standard biochemical processes that violate thermodynamic constraints. The technical language was dense and often incomprehensible to someone without advanced physics training, but the implications were clear. Dr. Walsh was developing scientific frameworks for understanding and predicting phenomena that officially didn't exist. Most intriguingly, I found several references to something called the Walsh Protocol, apparently a standardized procedure for analyzing and classifying anomalous objects and phenomena. The protocol included detailed steps for containment field calculation, anomalous property assessment, and risk evaluation methodology. The terminology was identical to what I'd seen in the SCP entries, but these documents predated the wiki by decades. Director James Morrison, whose signature had appeared on the original Millbrook document, turned out to be the administrative centre of the entire operation. Unlike the others, whose involvement seemed to be based on their specific expertise, Morrison appeared to be the person responsible for coordinating and managing the organisation's activities. His official title in most documents was simply Director, with no indication of what agency or department he represented. His authority seemed to transcend normal bureaucratic boundaries. I found documents showing him issuing orders to CIA personnel, military officers, academic researchers, and civilian contractors with equal authority. In 1975, Morrison had issued what became known as the Morrison Directive, a classified memorandum that established standardized procedures for handling anomalous phenomena discoveries. The directive was distributed to dozens of government agencies and established protocols that remained in use for decades. The key points of the Morrison Directive were: all anomalous phenomena were to be reported immediately to a central coordination office, regardless of which agency initially encountered them. Standard cover stories would be developed and implemented for each type of anomalous event to provide plausible explanations for witnesses and media. Specialized containment teams would be deployed to secure anomalous objects and locations until permanent solutions could be implemented. Witnesses would be subjected to narrative modification therapy to reduce the psychological impact of their experiences and minimize the risk of public disclosure. All information about anomalous phenomena would be compartmentalized using a new classification system that prevented any single individual from understanding the full scope of the organization's activities. The Morrison Directive essentially created a shadow government agency dedicated to managing impossible things, an organization that existed within and alongside traditional government structures, but operated according to completely different rules. The most recent phase of my investigation focused on understanding how this Cold War-era organization had adapted to the digital age. The answer was both brilliant and terrifying. They had transformed from a secretive government agency into a global, crowdsourced disinformation campaign. I found evidence that the transition had begun in the early 2000s, as traditional classification methods became increasingly inadequate for controlling information flow. The Morrison Directive was updated in 2004 with what was called the Digital Adaptation Protocol, which outlined strategies for managing anomalous information in the Internet age. The key innovation was the concept of protective fiction, deliberately creating false information that was so similar to real classified material that it would serve as camouflage. Instead of trying to suppress leaks, they would flood the information space with disinformation that made real leaks indistinguishable from creative writing. Dr. Frederick Holt, whose involvement in creating the SCP wiki I had already discovered, had been the architect of this new approach. His background in narrative psychology and internet community dynamics made him the perfect person to design a system that would harness collaborative creativity for intelligence purposes. The SCP Wiki was the prototype, but it wasn't the only platform they used. I found evidence of similar operations embedded in other collaborative fiction projects, alternate reality games, and even social media platforms. Anywhere people gathered to create and share stories, there was potential for hiding real information among the fiction. By 2024, the system had evolved into something far more sophisticated than its original creators had probably envisioned. The SCP Foundation had become a global phenomenon with millions of participants, professional quality content and cultural influence that extended far beyond its original internet community. But embedded within this creative community was a highly effective intelligence operation that continued to serve its original purpose, hiding impossible truths in plain sight. My analysis of recent SCP entries revealed that the pattern was continuing and possibly accelerating. Between 2020 and 2024, I identified over 60 entries that showed signs of being based on real classified material. These newer entries reflected more advanced phenomena and more sophisticated containment procedures, suggesting that the organization's capabilities had grown significantly over the decades. SCP-8923, uploaded in 2022, described a quantum consciousness entity that existed simultaneously across multiple dimensions. The technical specifications in the entry corresponded exactly to cutting-edge research in quantum mechanics and consciousness studies that was years ahead of publicly available knowledge. SCP-9156, posted in 2023, detailed a temporal stabilization device that could prevent paradoxes caused by time travel. The mathematical models embedded in the entry were based on theoretical physics that had only been published in the most advanced academic journals. SCP-9847, uploaded just 6 months ago, described a reality anchor technology that could maintain local stability in areas affected by anomalous space-time distortions. The engineering specifications were so advanced and detailed that they could only have come from actual research and development projects. The deeper I delved into this investigation, the more it began to affect my daily life. I found myself constantly second-guessing what was real and what was disinformation. Every news story, every scientific breakthrough, every unexplained event became a potential piece of the puzzle, or another layer of misdirection designed to keep me from seeing the truth. My work performance suffered as I became increasingly obsessed with the research. My supervisor, Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, called me into her office several times to discuss my declining productivity and apparent distraction. "David, you've been one of our most reliable archivists for 5 years," she said during our final meeting. "But lately, you seem to be spending more time on personal research projects than on your assigned work. Is there something going on that I should know about?" I wanted to tell her everything about the documents I'd found, the patterns I'd discovered, the terrifying implications of what I'd uncovered. But how could I explain that I'd stumbled upon evidence of a decades-long conspiracy to hide impossible phenomena by disguising them as internet fiction? How could I make her understand that some of the most popular collaborative fiction on the internet might actually be leaked classified documents? Instead, I mumbled something about being distracted by personal issues and promised to refocus on my assigned projects. But I knew I couldn't stop investigating. The truth was too important, and I was probably the only person in a position to uncover it. My personal relationships suffered as well. Friends stopped inviting me to social events because I couldn't stop talking about conspiracy theories and government cover-ups. My family became concerned about my mental health as I became increasingly isolated and paranoid. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to expose a conspiracy designed to make truth indistinguishable from fiction, I had become exactly the kind of person whose claims would be dismissed as delusional rambling. As I complete this account, I realise that I've become part of the very system I've been investigating. By writing down my discoveries and theories, I'm creating another layer of fiction that obscures the truth I'm trying to reveal. Anyone who reads this will have to decide whether it's a genuine investigation or an elaborate piece of creative writing in the SCP tradition. Maybe that's the ultimate genius of the system. It's self-perpetuating and self-protecting. Every attempt to expose it becomes part of the cover-up. Every revelation becomes another piece of fiction. Every truth becomes indistinguishable from a lie. The SCP Foundation, as a fictional organisation, doesn't exist. But something very much like it does exist. A real system for managing genuine anomalies that threaten our understanding of reality. It's a system that has evolved and adapted over decades, learning to hide not by suppressing information but by drowning it in disinformation. And all of us, every person who has ever read an SCP entry or contributed to the wiki or shared a story about impossible things, we're all part of it now. We're unwitting participants in the greatest intelligence operation in history, helping to maintain the secrecy of genuine anomalies by treating them as entertainment. The truth is out there, scattered among millions of words of collaborative fiction, but we'll never be able to separate the real from the fake, because the system has made separation impossible. Which entries are stories, and which ones are redacted truths that slip through the cracks of classification? We'll never know, because we're not supposed to know. We're supposed to enjoy the mystery, appreciate the creativity, and never seriously consider that some of it might be real. The perfect crime, hiding the impossible by making it seem inevitable that someone would make it up. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly how it should be. Maybe some truths are too dangerous for general knowledge. Maybe the real SCP Foundation, whatever it actually calls itself, is protecting us from realities we're not ready to handle. Or maybe they're protecting themselves from a world that would demand accountability for the impossible things they've discovered and the powers they've acquired. I don't know anymore. I can't tell the difference between truth and fiction, between investigation and paranoia, between discovery and delusion. But I do know this. The next time you read an SCP entry about an impossible creature, or a reality-bending artifact, ask yourself one question. What if it's real? Thank you for staying with us through this extended investigation into one of the most complex conspiracy theories we've ever explored. The line between truth and fiction has never been more blurred than it is in our digital age, where collaborative creativity and government secrecy intersect in ways we're only beginning to understand. Remember, the best disinformation doesn't deny the truth. It buries it under so many lies that finding it becomes impossible. Sweet dreams, and try not to think too hard about which stories might not be stories at all. What if everything you thought you knew about the pyramids was wrong? Imagine standing inside the Great Pyramid of Giza at midnight, alone, surrounded by 2.3 million stone blocks that have kept their secrets for over 4 millennia. The air is thick with mystery, and you can feel something humming beneath your feet. A vibration so subtle it might just be your imagination. Or might it be something far more extraordinary? Tonight joined Dr. Marcus Chen, a field researcher whose life's work straddles the boundary between archaeology and physics, as he uncovers evidence that will shake the very foundations of what we believe about ancient Egypt. This isn't just another story about pharaohs and burial chambers. This is about technology so advanced, so perfectly engineered, that modern science is only beginning to understand its true purpose. Are you ready to discover that the Great Pyramid wasn't built to house the dead, but to power the living? The desert wind carried more than sand that October evening. It carried the weight of 4,000 years of secrets, swirling around the massive limestone blocks that rose from the Giza Plateau like ancient guardians against the darkening sky. Dr. Marcus Chen pulled his field jacket tighter as he approached the entrance to the Great Pyramid, his archaeological permit clutched in one hand and a case of sensitive instruments in the other. For 15 years, Marcus had studied these monuments from afar, poring over blueprints in university libraries, analysing satellite imagery, and debating theories with colleagues over late-night coffee. He'd written papers on the pyramid's mathematical precision, its astronomical alignments, and its construction techniques. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this moment. The entrance shaft yawned before him like the mouth of some primordial beast. His Egyptian guide, Hassan, gestured him forward with a weathered hand that had led countless tourists through these passages. But tonight was different. Tonight Marcus had special permission to remain inside after closing, to conduct his research in the profound silence that only comes when the tourist crowds fade away. "Doctor?" "Chen," Hassan said, his English tinged with the accent of the Nile Delta. "You're sure you want to stay alone? The pyramid. She speaks differently at night." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what Hassan meant. "I need to take measurements without interference. The electromagnetic readings are too important to risk contamination from cameras and cell phones." As they ducked through the entrance and began their descent into the ancient passageway, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected. A subtle vibration through the soles of his boots. It was barely perceptible, like standing near a power plant or a subway station, but unmistakably present. The limestone blocks seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, as if the entire structure were somehow alive. "Hassan," he said, pausing to place his palm against the cool stone wall, "do you feel that?" The guide's eyes met his in the dim LED lighting they'd strung along the passage. "You feel it too?" Most visitors, they notice nothing, but some, the ones who know how to listen, they feel the heart of the pyramid beating. Marcus's scientific mind immediately began cataloguing possible explanations: seismic activity from Cairo traffic, thermal expansion and contraction of the limestone, perhaps underground water movement. But as they climbed deeper into the structure, following the grand gallery toward the king's chamber, the sensation only grew stronger. The textbooks had described every measurement, every angle, every architectural feature, but they had failed to capture this, the sense that he was walking through the corridors of a machine rather than a tomb. The walls weren't just precisely cut, they were purposeful, functional, as if each block had been positioned not just to support weight, but to channel something else entirely. By the time Hassan left him alone in the king's chamber with his instruments, and a promise to return at dawn, Marcus was beginning to suspect that everything he thought he knew about the Great Pyramid was about to change. The silence in the king's chamber was absolute. Not the gentle quiet of a library or the muffled stillness of a snow-covered landscape, but the profound absence of sound that only exists deep within solid rock far from the surface world. Marcus set his equipment case on the granite floor and began unpacking his instruments, but his eyes kept returning to the walls around him. For a structure supposedly built as the eternal resting place of Pharaoh Khufu, the king's chamber was remarkably empty. No hieroglyphs adorned the walls, no colourful depictions of the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife. No ornate decorations celebrating his divine status, just smooth, precisely fitted granite blocks that formed a perfect rectangular space. Marcus had visited dozens of legitimate Egyptian tombs, from the elaborate burial chambers in the Valley of the Kings to smaller mastabas scattered throughout the desert. Every single one had been filled with artwork, inscriptions and symbolic elements designed to guide and protect the deceased in the afterlife. The Egyptians were obsessive about decorating their tombs. It was perhaps their most distinctive cultural trait. So why was the most important tomb in Egypt completely bare? He pulled out his digital calipers and began measuring the chamber's dimensions, cross-referencing them with his notes. 10.47 metres long, 5.24 metres wide, 5.84 metres high. But as he worked, something else caught his attention. The acoustics. "Hello?" he called out softly, and the word came back to him transformed. Not a simple echo, but something more complex. A resonance that seemed to build upon itself, creating harmonics that his voice alone couldn't produce. He clapped his hands sharply and the sound reverberated through the chamber in waves, each echo slightly different from the last. Marcus had studied acoustical engineering as part of his physics background, and he knew what he was hearing. The chamber was tuned. The proportions, the materials, even the placement in the pyramid weren't arbitrary. They had been calculated to create specific resonant frequencies. He set up his sound meter and began a systematic test, clapping at different spots around the chamber and recording the acoustic response. The data was remarkable. The chamber was resonating at approximately 110 Hz, a frequency that research had shown could induce altered states of consciousness in humans. Ancient peoples around the world had built structures with similar acoustic properties. Newgrange in Ireland, the Hippogæum in Malta, certain chambers at Stonehenge. But there was something more. As Marcus moved his sound meter around the room, he noticed that the acoustic properties weren't uniform. The northeast corner produced different harmonics than the southwest. The centre of the chamber created the strongest resonance, while areas near the walls seemed to dampen certain frequencies while amplifying others. It was as if the entire chamber had been designed as a three-dimensional instrument, capable of producing complex acoustic patterns that modern sound engineers would struggle to replicate. This wasn't the work of ancient stonemasons building a burial vault. This was the product of sophisticated understanding of wave mechanics and acoustic engineering. Marcus sat cross-legged in the centre of the chamber and closed his eyes, letting the subtle vibrations he'd felt earlier wash over him. The sensation was stronger here, a low-frequency pulse that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. It reminded him of standing next to a massive pipe organ, feeling the bass notes resonating in his chest cavity. But there were no pipes here, no mechanical system that could produce such vibrations, unless... He opened his eyes and looked up at the ceiling, with its 9 massive granite beams supporting thousands of tons of limestone above. Each beam weighed between 25 and 80 tons, and had been quarried from Aswan 500 miles to the south. The precision with which they'd been placed was extraordinary. The gaps between them were uniform to within millimetres. What if those gaps weren't just structural? What if they were intentional spacing, designed to create specific resonant frequencies when subjected to external forces? The entire chamber could be functioning as a resonating cavity, with the granite beams acting as tuning elements. Marcus pulled out his electromagnetic field detector and switched it on. Immediately the device began registering low-level EM activity. Not strong, but definitely present and distinctly non-random. The readings were strongest near the walls and seemed to pulse in rhythm with the vibrations he could feel through the floor. No pharaoh had ever been found in this chamber. No evidence of burial had ever been discovered. No grave goods, no mummy. No indication that this space had ever served its supposed purpose as a tomb. But it was definitely serving some purpose. The question was, what? The next morning, Hassan returned to find Marcus still awake, surrounded by printouts from his instruments and covered in limestone dust. The researcher had spent the night exploring every accessible passage in the pyramid, and his findings were beginning to form a picture that contradicted everything in the archaeological textbooks. "Dr. Chen, you look like you have seen the jinn," Hassan said, offering him a thermos of strong coffee. "What did the pyramid tell you?" Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully and gestured toward his scattered notes. "Hassan, I need to see the subterranean chamber, the one most tourists never visit." Hassan's expression grew serious. "That chamber, she is dangerous. Very old, very deep. The air is not good there." "I have proper equipment," Marcus insisted, "and I think what's down there might be the key to understanding what this place really is." An hour later, they were descending through a narrow shaft that led to the lowest accessible level of the pyramid. The subterranean chamber lay more than 30 metres beneath the base of the structure, carved directly from the bedrock. As they went deeper, the temperature dropped and the air grew thick with moisture. The passage opened into a rough-hewn chamber unlike anything else in the pyramid. Where the king's chamber was precisely cut granite, this space looked unfinished, almost crude. But Marcus wasn't interested in the chamber itself, he was focused on the walls. "Hassan, bring the light closer." The LED beam revealed what Marcus had hoped to find: unmistakable signs of water erosion. The limestone walls bore the smooth, flowing patterns that only come from sustained contact with moving water. Not the random pitting of desert sandstorms or the crystalline deposits of occasional flooding, but the systematic erosion of deliberate water flow. Marcus ran his fingers along the channels carved into the rock. This wasn't occasional flooding. Water flowed through here regularly, probably for centuries. Hassan nodded. "My grandfather, he told stories. Before the dam, before the modern irrigation, the Nile would flood every year. Sometimes the water would find ways underground, through cracks and caves. Maybe it came here." But Marcus was thinking about more than just flood patterns. He pulled out a geological map of the area and spread it on his portable table. The Giza Plateau sat on a limestone shelf that extended deep underground, honeycombed with natural caves and passages. The Nile, just a few kilometres away, had carved its path through this same limestone over millions of years. Hassan, what if the annual flooding wasn't accidental? What if this chamber was designed to flood? He pointed to the roughly carved passages that branched off from the main chamber, disappearing into darkness. These could be intake channels. When the Nile floods, water would flow through underground passages and fill this chamber, then rise up through the pyramid's internal structure. Marcus began sketching a diagram, his excitement growing. "Look at this. Water enters here, rises through the Grand Gallery, which is angled like a spillway, and reaches the king's chamber. But that chamber isn't at the top of the pyramid. There are shafts leading up from it." Hassan studied the drawing. "You think the pyramid was some kind of water machine? Not just water. Think about what happens when you force pressurized water through granite." Hassan looked puzzled, so Marcus elaborated. "Granite contains quartz crystals. When you subject quartz to mechanical pressure, like water flowing under pressure, it generates electricity. It's called the piezoelectric effect. We use it in modern electronics." The implications were staggering. If Marcus was right, the Great Pyramid wasn't a tomb at all. It was a hydroelectric generator, using the annual Nile floods to create pressurized water flow through chambers lined with granite. The precise positioning of the granite blocks, the careful engineering of the internal passages, the acoustic tuning of the chambers, all of it could be explained as components of a massive power generation system. Marcus spent the next several hours taking measurements of the subterranean chamber, documenting the erosion patterns and mapping the passages. Every piece of evidence supported his growing hypothesis. The pyramid builders hadn't just been skilled stonemasons, they had been hydraulic engineers, working with an understanding of electricity that wouldn't be rediscovered until the 18th century. But that raised an even more disturbing question. If the ancient Egyptians possessed this level of technological sophistication, what else had they known that modern archaeology had missed? And why had this knowledge been lost? As they climbed back toward the surface, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking through the ruins of a civilization far more advanced than anyone had imagined. The desert wind that greeted them at the pyramid's entrance seemed to carry whispers of forgotten science, lost wisdom, and secrets that someone had gone to great lengths to hide. The next day found Marcus standing on the Giza Plateau at dawn, his GPS equipment spread out on a folding table, as the first rays of sunlight painted the ancient stones in shades of gold and amber. Hassan had brought along his cousin Karim, a modern engineer who worked for the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and had access to more sophisticated surveying equipment than Marcus could carry. "Dr. Chen, you said you wanted to verify the pyramid's alignment," Karim asked, adjusting the precision GPS receiver. "I must tell you, this has been measured many times. The accuracy is well documented." Marcus nodded, checking his own instruments. "I'm not questioning the accuracy. I'm trying to understand why that accuracy was necessary." The numbers were indeed remarkable. As the GPS data streamed in and the surveying laser painted its invisible lines across the desert, the measurements confirmed what archaeologists had known for decades. The Great Pyramid was aligned to true north, with an accuracy of just 3 arc minutes, less than 1/20th of a degree. In modern terms, that was more precise than the magnetic compasses available to 19th century explorers. But Marcus was looking at more than just cardinal directions. He had brought along a magnetometer, an instrument that could detect variations in the Earth's magnetic field. As he moved the device around the pyramid's base, the readings told a fascinating story. "Karim, look at this." Marcus showed him the magnetometer display. "The pyramid isn't just aligned to true north, it's positioned at a point where the Earth's magnetic field shows unusual characteristics. The Giza Plateau sat at a convergence point of several magnetic anomalies. Underground iron ore deposits created localized field variations, while the limestone bedrock contained enough ferrous minerals to influence compass readings. But more significantly, the pyramid's position corresponded to a point where the Earth's natural electromagnetic currents were particularly strong. Marcus had studied similar phenomena at other ancient sites. Stonehenge sat on a complex intersection of underground streams and geological fault lines that created measurable electromagnetic effects. Newgrange in Ireland was positioned where 2 underground rivers converged, creating conditions that produced natural electrical fields. Machu Picchu was built on a granite peak that generated piezoelectric charges during seismic activity. The pattern was consistent. Ancient builders had chosen locations where the Earth's natural electromagnetic properties were enhanced. They hadn't just been looking for stable ground or religious significance, they had been searching for specific energetic conditions. "Hassan," Marcus called to his guide, who was photographing the sunrise from the pyramid's eastern face, "your grandfather's stories. Did any of them mention lights?" Hassan walked over, his expression thoughtful. "Lights? You mean like the tourist illumination?" "No, I mean lights that might have been seen historically, strange lights, unexplained phenomena." Hassan's eyes widened slightly. "Ah, yes. The old people, they would speak of the lights that danced around the pyramid during certain seasons, usually during the flood time, when the Nile was high. They called them the souls of the pharaohs, but my grandfather, he was educated man. He thought maybe they were something else." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. What kind of something else? He worked for British archaeologists in the 1920s. They had instruments, cameras. One night during flood season, they saw lights moving around the pyramid's apex. Blue-white lights, like electricity. The photographs they took showed, what do you call them? Discharge patterns. Electromagnetic discharge. Marcus had seen similar phenomena at other ancient sites during periods of high atmospheric electricity. If the pyramid was designed to interact with the Earth's electromagnetic field, then during certain conditions, perhaps when underground water levels were high and atmospheric electrical activity was increased, it might actually generate visible electrical discharges. Marcus spent the morning taking detailed measurements of the electromagnetic conditions around the pyramid. The data revealed a complex pattern of electrical activity that varied with the time of day, the season, and the underground water levels. The pyramid wasn't just passively sitting in an electromagnetically active location. It appeared to be designed to harness and focus that activity. The internal structure suddenly made more sense. The king's chamber, with its precise granite construction, would act as a focal point for electromagnetic energy generated by the pressure of water on quartz crystals. The shaft systems leading from the chamber would serve as waveguides, directing the electrical energy toward the pyramid's apex. The entire structure was essentially a massive electromagnetic antenna, designed to capture, generate and transmit electrical energy using natural forces. But transmit it where? And for what purpose? As Marcus packed his equipment, he realized he was no longer looking at an ancient tomb or even an advanced power plant. He was looking at a piece of technology so sophisticated that modern science was only beginning to understand its principles. The builders of the Great Pyramid hadn't just mastered hydraulic engineering and electromagnetic theory. They had created a machine that interfaced directly with the planet's own energy systems. The question that haunted him as they walked back to the nearby village was this: if such advanced technology had existed over 4,000 years ago, what had happened to the civilization that created it? Dr. Amara Soliman met Marcus at a coffee shop in central Cairo, away from the tourist crowds and government oversight that surrounded the Giza Plateau. As one of Egypt's leading thermal imaging specialists, she'd been involved in some of the most significant recent discoveries at the pyramids, including the 2015 detection of mysterious voids within the Great Pyramid structure. "Dr. Chen," she said, sliding a tablet across the small table between them, "what you're asking to see, these images are not for public distribution. The Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities has been very careful about how this information is released." Marcus studied the thermal imaging data on the screen. The pyramid appeared as a three-dimensional wireframe, with different colours indicating temperature variations within the stone. But there, clearly visible in the computer-enhanced images, were several dark voids, empty spaces within the solid limestone structure where no chambers were supposed to exist. "How many voids have you detected?" Marcus asked. "At least 4 significant ones," Dr. Soliman replied, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. 2 above the king's chamber, 1 behind the queen's chamber, and 1 near the base that appears to connect to the subterranean areas. But there's something else. She switched to a different set of images, these taken with ground-penetrating radar and electromagnetic sensors. These voids aren't natural. They show clear geometric patterns, right angles, precisely measured dimensions. Someone built these spaces intentionally, then sealed them so completely that they've remained hidden for over 4,000 years. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Have there been any attempts to access them?" Dr. Solomon's expression grew troubled. "That's where things become political." In 2017, an international team proposed using micro-robotics to explore one of the smaller voids. They had the technology, the funding, and preliminary approval from the Archaeological Committee. Then suddenly the project was cancelled. No explanation, no appeal process, just stopped. She leaned closer, her voice barely audible above the coffee shop's ambient noise. "Dr. Chen, I've worked on heritage preservation projects throughout Egypt for 15 years. I've seen government bureaucracy, funding problems, international disputes over archaeological sites. This was different. This was suppression." Marcus thought about his own experience getting research permission. The process had taken 8 months and required letters of recommendation from 3 different universities, a detailed research proposal, and a substantial fee. But even with all that paperwork, his access was limited to already known chambers during specific time windows. "What do you think is in the sealed chambers?" he asked. Dr. Solomon switched to another set of images, these showing electromagnetic anomalies within the hidden voids. These readings suggest metallic objects, not just small artifacts, large structures with geometric patterns. If I had to guess based on the electromagnetic signatures, I'd say we're looking at copper or bronze constructions, possibly in the form of coils or geometric frameworks. Marcus's mind raced. Copper coils would be consistent with his power plant hypothesis. They could serve as electromagnetic conductors, or even primitive electrical components. Bronze geometric frameworks might function as focusing elements for electromagnetic energy. "There's something else, Doctor," Solomon continued, bringing up a final image. "This thermal scan was taken during different seasons over a 3-year period. Look at how the temperature signatures in the voids change. The hidden chambers appeared to respond to external conditions, cooling during dry seasons and warming during periods of high humidity. More intriguingly, the temperature variations showed patterns that corresponded to the Nile's traditional flood cycle, even though the river had been controlled by dams for decades. It's as if these chambers are still responding to environmental changes," Dr. Solomon said, "as if whatever system they're part of is still partially functional." Marcus studied the data for several minutes, his theory crystallizing into something approaching certainty. The Great Pyramid wasn't just an ancient power plant. It was a machine with components that were still sealed inside, still responding to the same environmental triggers that had activated it thousands of years ago. Dr. Solomon, hypothetically, if someone wanted to access these chambers using modern technology, how would they do it? She looked around the coffee shop nervously. Hypothetically, millimeter wave radar could map the internal structure precisely. Microbore drilling could create access holes small enough to insert fibre optic cameras. With the right equipment, you could explore these spaces without causing significant structural damage to the pyramid. Marcus nodded, already calculating what such an expedition would cost and how it might be organised. But Dr. Solomon wasn't finished. Dr. Chen, there's something you should know. I'm not the first person to detect these chambers, and I won't be the last. But every researcher who has tried to investigate them seriously has found their access restricted, their funding cut, or their careers redirected. The Egyptian government isn't trying to preserve the pyramid from damage. They're trying to preserve its secrets from discovery. As Marcus walked back through Cairo's bustling streets, he realised he was no longer conducting academic research. He was investigating a cover-up that had been maintained for decades, possibly longer. The question was no longer what the pyramid had been designed to do. It was why someone was so determined to prevent modern science from finding out. That night, Marcus returned to the pyramid alone. Hassan had arranged for him to have extended access, though the guide had seemed reluctant to leave him there as darkness settled over the Giza plateau. Dr. Chen, the pyramid. She's different at night. You be careful, yes? Some knowledge, it comes with price. Now, sitting in absolute darkness in the king's chamber with his instruments powered down and his cell phone turned off, Marcus could feel what Hassan had meant. The vibrations he'd noticed on his first day weren't stronger at night. They were clearer, unmasked by the electromagnetic interference of modern technology and the subtle vibrations of daytime activity. The feeling was unmistakable now, a low-frequency pulse that seemed to emanate from the very stones around him. It reminded him of sitting in a car with a powerful subwoofer, feeling the bass notes resonating in his chest. Except this sensation seemed to penetrate deeper, affecting not just his body but his consciousness itself. Marcus had brought along a new piece of equipment, a sensitive electromagnetic field detector borrowed from Dr. Solomon's laboratory. In the complete darkness and electrical silence of the chamber, the device could register even the faintest electromagnetic activity. He switched it on and watched the display with growing amazement. The pyramid was generating electricity. Not much. The readings were measured in millivolts and microamps, but the output was consistent, rhythmic, and definitely real. The electromagnetic field strength varied in cycles that corresponded to the acoustic resonance he'd measured earlier. The entire structure was functioning as a low-level electrical generator, powered by forces he was only beginning to understand. Marcus activated his night vision camera and began recording, speaking in whispers to avoid disturbing whatever delicate processes he was observing. The electromagnetic readings are strongest near the northeast corner of the chamber, consistent with the acoustic anomalies I documented earlier. The field strength appears to correlate with lunar cycles. Tonight's readings are approximately 20% higher than last week's, coinciding with the new moon. He moved the detector around the chamber, mapping the electromagnetic field as he had mapped the acoustics. The patterns were complex but consistent, forming a three-dimensional matrix of electrical activity that encompassed the entire chamber. At the centre of the room, where the pharaoh's sarcophagus should have been, the electromagnetic field reached its peak intensity. But there was something else. As Marcus sat in the centre of the chamber, surrounded by the electrical field generated by 4,000 years of precisely engineered stone, he began to experience something unexpected, altered consciousness. It started as a subtle shift in perception, similar to the disorientation he'd felt at high altitude or during meditation. But as he remained motionless in the electromagnetic field, the sensation deepened. His thoughts became clearer, more focused, while his awareness of the chamber around him expanded. He could sense the massive weight of the pyramid above him, the underground chambers below, even the subtle movements of air through the shaft systems. Marcus realised that the 110 Hz acoustic resonance he'd measured wasn't accidental. It was the exact frequency that research had shown could induce theta brainwave states associated with deep meditation, enhanced creativity, and altered consciousness. Combined with the electromagnetic field, the King's Chamber functioned as a consciousness-altering device. But why? What purpose would ancient builders have had for creating a machine that could systematically alter human consciousness? As Marcus sat in the pyramid's electromagnetic embrace, understanding dawned on him like sunrise over the desert. The pyramid wasn't just a power plant, it was a communication device. The electrical energy it generated wasn't meant to power lights or machinery, it was designed to amplify and transmit human consciousness itself. The ancient Egyptians had built the ultimate meditation chamber, a place where human awareness could be enhanced, expanded, and potentially transmitted across vast distances. The precision engineering, the electromagnetic properties, the acoustic tuning, all of it served to create conditions where consciousness could transcend the normal limitations of the human brain. Marcus thought about the ancient Egyptian concepts of Ka and Ba, aspects of the human soul that could travel beyond the physical body. What if these weren't just religious beliefs, but actual descriptions of consciousness, projection experiences facilitated by the pyramid's technology? The implications were staggering. If ancient Egyptians had mastered consciousness projection, they could have explored distant lands without physical travel, communicated across vast distances without messengers, and perhaps even preserved knowledge in ways that transcended physical destruction. The pyramid might have been their internet, their telecommunications network, their method of backing up human consciousness itself. Marcus's instruments continued recording as his awareness expanded further. He could sense other presences in the chamber, not supernatural entities, but echoes of the thousands of people who had experienced altered states in this space over the millennia. The pyramid had been accumulating consciousness, storing it in some form that science didn't yet understand. As the hours passed, Marcus began to comprehend the magnitude of what he'd discovered. The Great Pyramid wasn't just an ancient monument, it was a machine for expanding human potential, built by a civilization that understood the relationship between consciousness, electromagnetic energy, and the fundamental structure of reality itself. But why had this knowledge been lost, and why were modern authorities so determined to prevent its rediscovery? As dawn approached and the electromagnetic readings began to fluctuate with the rising sun, Marcus made a decision that would change the course of his research, and possibly his life. He wasn't going to publish his findings in academic journals where they could be dismissed or suppressed. He was going to find a way to demonstrate the pyramid's true capabilities to the world. The Age of Secrets was about to end. 3 weeks after his night in the King's Chamber, Marcus found himself in a secure conference room at Cairo University, surrounded by researchers who had responded to his carefully worded communications. Dr. Solomon sat across from him, along with Dr. James Morrison, a British archaeoacoustic specialist, Dr. Elena Kozlov, a Russian electromagnetic researcher, and surprisingly, Dr. Sarah Running Bear, a Lakota physicist who studied indigenous sacred sites in North America. "What you're suggesting, Doctor?" "Chen," Dr. Morrison said, reviewing Marcus's data on his tablet, "goes beyond revolutionary. You're proposing that ancient civilizations possess technology that we're only beginning to understand." Marcus nodded, pulling up a global map on the room's display screen. Red dots marked locations across every continent. It's not just a proposal anymore. Thanks to Dr. Running Bear's research, we've identified 47 sites worldwide that show identical electromagnetic signatures to the Great Pyramid. Dr. Running Bear leaned forward, her voice carrying the weight of generational knowledge. "My people have always known that certain places were different. We called them places where the earth speaks, the acoustic properties, the electromagnetic anomalies, the consciousness-altering effects. They're all documented in our oral traditions." She pointed to several dots in North America. Serpent Mound in Ohio, the Medicine Wheels of Wyoming, certain kivas in the southwest. They all show the same engineering principles. Positioning at electromagnetic convergence points, internal geometries designed for acoustic resonance, materials chosen for their piezoelectric properties. Dr. Kozlov, who had been quietly analysing electromagnetic data, looked up with excitement. "I've been comparing the frequency patterns from these sites. They're not random, they form a harmonic sequence. Each site resonates at frequencies that complement the others, as if they were designed to work together as a single system." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. A single system spanning the entire globe. More than that, Dr. Kozlov continued, pulling up a complex waveform analysis. If all these sites were activated simultaneously, the combined electromagnetic output would create a standing wave pattern around the Earth. The planet itself would become a resonating chamber. The implications hung heavy in the room. Marcus thought back to his experience in the King's Chamber, the sense of connecting not just to the pyramid, but to something vast and worldwide. Had he been tapping into a dormant global network that once linked human consciousness across continents? Dr. Morrison cleared his throat. "There's something else we need to consider. I've been analysing historical records of these sites, looking for patterns of suppression. It's remarkable how consistently ancient knowledge about these places has been discouraged." He brought up a timeline on his laptop. The Library of Alexandria burned multiple times, always targeting texts about natural philosophy and sacred geometry. The Spanish conquistadors systematically destroyed Mayan and Aztec codices that contained astronomical and architectural knowledge. The British Empire consistently relocated indigenous populations away from sites that showed electromagnetic anomalies. Dr. Running Bear's expression darkened. "My ancestors were forced from sacred sites across North America. The official reason was always agricultural development or mineral rights, but they consistently targeted places where consciousness-altering experiences were known to occur." Marcus felt a chill of recognition. The same pattern of suppression he'd encountered with the pyramid's hidden chambers was part of a much larger historical trend. Someone, or some group, had been systematically working for centuries to prevent humanity from rediscovering its technological and spiritual heritage. "The question is," Dr. Solomon said quietly, "what would happen if we reactivated this network?" Dr. Solomon's question haunted Marcus for days. The theoretical implications of reactivating an ancient global consciousness network were staggering, but the practical challenges seemed insurmountable. Most of the sites were under government control, protected by restricted access, or surrounded by modern development that would interfere with their electromagnetic properties. But Marcus couldn't let go of what he'd experienced in the King's Chamber. The sense of expanded awareness, of connection to something vast and ancient, had fundamentally changed his understanding of human potential. If that experience could be replicated and shared, it might represent the next stage of human evolution. The answer came from an unexpected source. Hassan appeared at Marcus's hotel room door early one morning, carrying a worn leather satchel and wearing an expression of nervous determination. "Doctor, Chen, my family. We have been guardians longer than we have been guides. My great-grandfather, before the British came, before the tourists, he was keeper of the old knowledge." Hassan opened the satchel to reveal documents that made Marcus's breath catch. Hand-drawn maps showing underground passages throughout the Giza Plateau. Detailed diagrams of the pyramid's internal structure, including chambers that weren't on any official archaeological survey, and most remarkably technical drawings that showed how the pyramid's systems could be manually activated. "The old knowledge, it was never lost completely," Hassan continued. "Hidden, yes. Dangerous to speak of, yes. But preserved by families like mine, waiting for someone who could understand its importance." The drawings revealed that the pyramid's consciousness-amplifying effects weren't automatic. They required specific activation procedures. Water had to be introduced into the subterranean chambers at precise volumes and timing. Certain crystals needed to be placed in the sealed chambers to focus the electromagnetic fields. And most crucially, multiple people had to participate simultaneously, their consciousness working together to achieve resonance with the global network. "Hassan, this is incredible, but how could we possibly implement it? We'd need access to the sealed chambers, permission for extended stays in the pyramid, and coordination with researchers at sites around the world." Hassan smiled, the expression of a man who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. "Dr. Chen, who do you think has been maintaining the pyramid systems all these years? The tourist guides, the security staff, the maintenance workers, many of us are descendants of the original Guardians. We have been waiting for someone like you, someone who could understand what we have been protecting. Over the next few hours, Hassan revealed the existence of a network of Guardians at ancient sites worldwide. Families who had maintained the old knowledge for generations, keeping the sites minimally functional while waiting for the time when they could be fully reactivated. The suppression Marcus had encountered wasn't just from modern governments. It was part of an ancient conflict between those who sought to preserve transformative knowledge and those who feared its implications for existing power structures. But now, Hassan said, his eyes bright with possibility, the time of hiding is ending. The world is ready for the old wisdom to return. Marcus spent the next week in secret meetings with Hassan's network. They showed him hidden passages that connected the pyramids at Giza to underground chambers extending for kilometers beneath the desert. They revealed caches of ancient crystals and metallic components that could be used to restore the pyramid's full functionality. Most remarkably, they demonstrated that they had been maintaining contact with Guardian networks at other sites around the world, using methods that seemed to blend ancient wisdom with modern technology. The plan they developed was audacious beyond anything Marcus had imagined. On the night of the next new moon, when electromagnetic conditions would be optimal, Guardian networks at 12 major sites would simultaneously activate their monuments' consciousness-amplifying systems. The Great Pyramid would serve as the primary node, with Marcus and the research team providing scientific documentation of the process. If successful, the experiment would create the first coordinated activation of the global consciousness network in over 3,000 years. The effects, according to the Guardian's preserved knowledge, would be felt worldwide. A sudden expansion of human awareness that could fundamentally alter the course of civilization. But there were risks. The ancient texts spoke of individuals who had been unprepared for the experience, whose consciousness had been overwhelmed by the sudden expansion of awareness. There were warnings about the network attracting the attention of forces that had opposed its use in the past, and there was the very real possibility that modern governments would respond to the activation with force, viewing it as a threat to established order. As Marcus stood in the King's Chamber 1 week before the planned activation, surrounded by crystals and metallic components that Hassan's people had been safeguarding for millennia, he realized that he was about to participate in either the most important experiment in human history or the most dangerous. The pyramid hummed around him with renewed energy, its systems responding to the presence of the missing components. Through his consciousness, he could sense the other sites coming online around the world, their guardians preparing for an event that would either herald humanity's next evolutionary leap or mark the end of the age of secrets forever. The night of the new moon arrived with unprecedented atmospheric conditions. Aurora activity extended far beyond the polar regions, creating shimmering curtains of light visible even in Egypt's desert sky. Electromagnetic storms disrupted satellite communications worldwide, while seismic monitoring stations detected subtle but synchronized vibrations from ancient sites across the globe. Marcus stood in the King's Chamber surrounded by Hassan's Guardian network and the international research team. The chamber had been transformed. Crystalline structures now occupied the corners, their faceted surfaces catching and redirecting the subtle light from their instruments. Copper coils, fashioned according to ancient diagrams, had been positioned to enhance the room's natural electromagnetic properties. Most remarkably, water from the Nile's ancient flood channels had been carefully directed into the subterranean chambers, creating the hydraulic pressure needed to activate the pyramid's piezoelectric systems. Dr. Running Bear checked her communication device one final time. Serpent Mound is reporting full activation. The electromagnetic readings are unlike anything we've ever recorded. Dr. Morrison, monitoring from Newgrange and Ireland, transmitted similar reports. The acoustic resonance here is building beyond our measurement capabilities. The entire mound is vibrating in harmony with frequencies we didn't know existed. Around the world, Guardian networks at sites from Machu Picchu to Angkor Wat were reporting the same phenomenon. Ancient monuments that had been dormant for millennia were awakening. their consciousness-amplifying systems responding to coordinated activation for the first time in recorded history. In the King's Chamber, Marcus felt the familiar sensation of expanded awareness beginning to build, but this time it was different, stronger, more focused, and connected to something vast beyond individual consciousness. Through the electromagnetic field generated by the activated pyramid, he could sense the presence of people at the other sites, their awareness merging into a collective experience that transcended physical distance. Dr. Kozlov, monitoring the electromagnetic readings, whispered in amazement, "The standing wave pattern is forming exactly as predicted. The Earth's electromagnetic field is reorganizing itself around these sites." But the experience went beyond scientific measurement. As the network reached full activation, Marcus found his consciousness expanding not just across space but across time. He could sense the pyramid builders themselves, not as historical figures but as present awareness, as if their consciousness had been preserved within the structure itself, waiting for this moment of reactivation. The ancient Egyptians hadn't just built a machine for amplifying consciousness, they had created a means of preserving it across millennia. The pyramid was a library of human awareness, containing the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that had achieved levels of understanding that modern science was only beginning to approach. Through the network, Marcus experienced visions of the ancient world as it had truly been. Not the primitive civilization described in history textbooks, but a global culture connected by consciousness-amplifying technology, capable of feats that seemed magical only because the principles had been forgotten. He saw the construction of the monuments not as slave labour directed by megalomaniacal pharaohs, but as collaborative projects undertaken by people who understood their role in maintaining humanity's connection to higher levels of awareness. Most remarkably, he experienced the reason why the network had been deactivated. As human civilizations became more hierarchical and centralized, the egalitarian consciousness expansion technology had been seen as a threat to emerging power structures. Rulers who depended on controlling information and limiting awareness had systematically dismantled the network, replacing consciousness-expanding wisdom traditions with belief systems that emphasized obedience and separation. The suppression hadn't been accidental. It had been deliberate, coordinated across cultures and centuries by those who understood that widespread access to expanded consciousness would make traditional forms of dominance impossible to maintain. But the network had been designed with safeguards. The consciousness of its builders had been preserved within the structures themselves, waiting for a time when humanity would be ready to reclaim its heritage. That time, Marcus realized, was now. As the activation reached its peak, effects began manifesting around the world. Dr. Running Bear reported that people living near the activated sites were spontaneously experiencing expanded states of consciousness. Emergency services were receiving calls about strange lights and telepathic experiences. Social media was flooded with reports of sudden insights, creative breakthroughs, and experiences of connection that transcended normal human limitations. But there was resistance as well. Military aircraft were scrambling towards several of the activated sites. Government communications were buzzing with references to unauthorized experiments and potential security threats. The same forces that had suppressed the ancient knowledge were mobilizing to contain its return. Hassan, who had been monitoring communications with Guardian networks worldwide, turned to Marcus with urgent concern. "Doctor, Chen, we have perhaps 30 minutes before official intervention begins. The network is fully activated, but maintaining it will require ongoing commitment from people around the world." Marcus understood. The ancient network hadn't been maintained by technology alone. It had required conscious participation from people who understood its importance. The reactivation was just the beginning. For the consciousness-expanding effects to continue, individuals at sites around the world would need to take responsibility for maintaining the system, despite inevitable opposition from established power structures. As sirens began wailing in the distance and the first military helicopters appeared on the horizon, Marcus made his final recordings. The scientific data would be crucial for documenting what had occurred, but the real proof would be the ongoing transformation of human consciousness that the network had initiated. The age of secrets was truly ending. But as Marcus and his team prepared to face the consequences of their world-changing experiment, he realized that the real work was just beginning. 6 months after the global awakening, as the media had dubbed it, Marcus sat in a small cafe in Prague, one of dozens of cities where consciousness research centres had spontaneously emerged. Around the world, people who had experienced the network activation had begun gathering, sharing their experiences and developing new applications for expanded awareness. The official response had been predictable. Governments had classified the event as a coordinated hoax involving atmospheric anomalies and mass suggestion. The Guardian networks had been disbanded, the sites placed under increased security, and several researchers had found their careers and funding mysteriously terminated. But the consciousness genie was out of the bottle. Dr. Running Bear, now leading a consortium of indigenous researchers, had documented over 10,000 cases of enhanced psychic abilities manifesting in people who had been near activated sites. Dr. Kozlov was working with a network of physicists who had detected fundamental changes in quantum field behaviour around former network locations. Even Dr. Morrison, despite losing his university position, continued documenting the ongoing acoustic anomalies at ancient sites worldwide. Most remarkably, people were spontaneously rediscovering consciousness expansion techniques that had been lost for millennia. Meditation practices, acoustic healing methods, and electromagnetic sensitivity training were emerging independently in communities around the globe, as if the network activation had reawakened dormant human capabilities. Hassan had become something of a folk hero in Egypt, his family's guardianship role finally acknowledged by people who had experienced the pyramid's true power. Though official access remained restricted, underground tours of the pyramid's hidden systems had become a pilgrimage for those seeking direct experience of expanded consciousness. Marcus himself had changed profoundly. The night in the activated King's Chamber had left him with permanent access to expanded awareness states. He could sense the electromagnetic fields of other people, communicate telepathically with others who had experienced the network, and access information through methods that conventional science couldn't explain. But perhaps the most significant change was happening at a societal level. The consciousness expansion experienced by millions of people worldwide had created a generation less susceptible to manipulation, more capable of independent thinking, and naturally inclined toward cooperation rather than competition. Political movements based on fear and division were finding it increasingly difficult to gain traction. Economic systems that depended on artificial scarcity and manufactured desire were being replaced by resource-sharing networks organised through enhanced human communication abilities. The ancient pyramid builders' greatest achievement wasn't the monuments themselves, it was the civilization they had made possible. A society where expanded consciousness was the norm rather than the exception, where human potential was fully realised, and where technology served to enhance rather than replace natural human capabilities. As Marcus finished his coffee and prepared for another day of documenting the ongoing transformation, he reflected on the pyramid's true message. The structure itself had been important, but it was ultimately just a tool. The real power had always been within human consciousness itself, the capacity for awareness to expand, connect, and transcend the limitations that seemed so absolute. The pyramids had been built not to house the dead, but to awaken the living, and after 4,000 years of slumber, humanity was finally ready to reclaim its birthright. Standing in the Prague sunlight, Marcus could sense the presence of others around the world who had experienced the awakening. Through the invisible network that still connected activated sites, he felt their determination to ensure that the consciousness-expanding knowledge would never again be lost or suppressed. They told us the pyramids were tombs, but standing here, I know that's a lie. This wasn't built to bury the dead. It was built to keep the world alive, to preserve and transmit the highest potentials of human consciousness across the millennia, waiting for a time when humanity would be ready to reclaim its forgotten heritage. That time had finally come. The age of expanded consciousness had begun, and no force on earth could put the awakened human spirit back to sleep. The network hummed silently across the globe, connecting minds and hearts in ways that transcended physical distance. The ancient Guardian's work was complete. The future of human consciousness stretched ahead like dawn breaking over the desert, infinite with possibility. Marcus smiled, feeling the pyramid's eternal presence in his consciousness, and stepped forward into humanity's transformed tomorrow. What if the most dangerous secrets aren't hidden in classified files, but buried in plain sight, in the footnotes of forgotten academic papers? What if the government's most classified unit wasn't studying aliens at all, but something far more terrifying? Something that's been manipulating human belief since the dawn of civilization itself. Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to give a shout out to Jeffernan 1772 for suggesting this incredible topic. Your video ideas keep sleep theories going, so please drop your suggestions in the comments below, and if you're enjoying these deep dives into the unknown, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's talk about the Collins Elite, and why they might be the most important government program you've never heard of. I wasn't looking for UFOs, I was looking for a way to pay rent. The gig economy had chewed me up and spit me out more times than I cared to count. Web design, freelance writing, even a brief stint delivering food, nothing stuck. But when Dr. Martinelli at the university offered me work as a research assistant, scanning old theological dissertations for the digital archive, I jumped at it. $25 an hour to sit in a quiet library basement, copying dusty Latin passages and obscure biblical references that nobody had touched in decades. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. The work was mind-numbing mostly. Endless pages of theological debates from the 1950s and 60s, written by seminary students who were probably dead by now. The Augustinian interpretation of angelic hierarchies, post-war perspectives on demonic manifestation, scriptural analysis of divine intervention in modern context. Heavy stuff, but about as exciting as watching paint dry. I'd been at it for 3 months when I found the reference that changed everything. It was October, around 2 a.m. I was halfway through a 1963 thesis titled Angelic Manifestations in Modern Times, 324 pages of dense theological argumentation by a seminarian named Marcus Whitmore. The kind of paper that made me question every life choice that had led me to that basement. I was scanning page 187, a particularly dry section about contemporary witness testimony, when a footnote caught my eye. It wasn't the content that stopped me, it was the context. The main text was discussing reports of luminous beings, witnessed by various clergy members throughout the 1950s. Standard religious stuff. The kind of mystical experiences that show up in seminary papers all the time. But the footnote read, "For governmental perspective on similar phenomena, see Collins Elite Memorandum 1957, classification status unknown." I stared at that line for a full minute. It was cited like a real source, with the matter-of-fact tone of academic reference. No explanation, no context, just there. The problem was, this wasn't a section about government or politics. It was about angels. And the thesis was written by a seminary student, not a political science major. So why was he referencing what sounded like a classified government document in the middle of a paper about divine manifestations? I made a note and kept scanning, but the reference nagged at me. Collins Elite. It sounded official, maybe military, but why would a religious scholar in 1963 have access to classified material, and why would he cite it so casually, as if his readers would know what he was talking about? The next day, I couldn't concentrate on my assigned documents. Instead, I found myself searching the university's digital catalogue for any mention of Collins Elite. Nothing came up in the main database, but I had access to some of the restricted theological archives through Dr. Martinelli's login credentials. That's where I found the second reference. It was in a 1959 lecture transcript from a Catholic seminary in Maryland. The speaker was Father Benedict Toretti, discussing unusual spiritual encounters in the post-war era. Most of the lecture was standard theological fare, but near the end, during what appeared to be an informal Q&A session, someone asked about government interest in religious phenomena. Father Toretti's response was brief but loaded. There are those in Washington who understand that not all mysteries can be solved with science. The Collins Elite represents a different approach to certain questions, but we must be careful not to mistake understanding for wisdom or documentation for truth. The transcript noted uncomfortable silence after this comment, and the lecture ended shortly thereafter. 2 references, 2 religious contexts, both suggesting that Collins Elite was some kind of government program dealing with spiritual or supernatural phenomena. But why were religious scholars the only ones talking about it? And why did they all seem nervous about it? I spent the rest of the week diving deeper into the theological archives. The pattern that emerged was both fascinating and disturbing. Collins Elite didn't show up in UFO journals or conspiracy magazines. It didn't appear in scientific papers or military histories. Instead, it haunted the footnotes of religious documents like a ghost that only clergy could see. A 1958 exorcism report from a priest in New Mexico mentioned consultation with Collins Elite regarding non-terrestrial influences. A 1962 seminary paper on demonic deception in the modern age included a cryptic reference to Collins Elite protocols for distinguishing spiritual from extraplanetary phenomena. A 1961 lecture on comparative religion contained a single chilling line. As the Collins Elite has documented, the same entities that once appeared as gods now masquerade as visitors from the stars. Each reference was brief, almost coded, like the authors were speaking to an audience that would understand the implications without needing explanation. And always, the references appeared in contexts dealing with the supernatural, the spiritual, the otherworldly, but never in the way you'd expect. These weren't discussions of government cover-ups or alien conspiracies. They were warnings, theological warnings about deception, about false prophets, about entities that wore whatever mask humanity was willing to believe. I was starting to get a picture of something much stranger than a typical black project. Collins Elite wasn't studying UFOs the way the Air Force was. They were studying them the way the Catholic Church studied demons. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a misfiled document. I was scanning a collection of 1964 seminary papers when I found something that didn't belong. Mixed in with discussions of Vatican II reforms and modern catechism was a single-page document that looked nothing like the others. It was typed on official letterhead, something called Interdenominational Council on Anomalous Phenomena, and dated March 15th, 1959. The document was brief. Memo. Regarding recent Collins Elite Briefing 2, member institutions from Council Secretary following last week's presentation by Dr. Edward Collins regarding non-corporeal intelligence manifestations. The Council recommends the following protocols for clergy encountering anomalous phenomena. Do not assume extraterrestrial origin 2. Apply traditional discernment practices 3. Document all encounters per Collins Elite Guidelines 4. Report suspected deception campaigns immediately. Remember, the same entities that demanded worship as Baal and Moloch now request our trust as benevolent space brothers. The mask changes, the deception remains constant. Father Michael Torino, Council Secretary. My hands were shaking as I read it. This wasn't just a reference to Collins Elite. This was evidence of direct collaboration between the program and religious institutions. They were briefing clergy on how to handle UFO encounters, but from a theological perspective. And that last paragraph, it was suggesting that UFO entities weren't aliens at all. They were something much older and more dangerous, masquerading as extraterrestrials just as they had once masqueraded as ancient gods. I photographed the document with my phone and started digging into this interdenominational council. What I found made my blood run cold. The Interdenominational Council on Anomalous Phenomena existed from 1957 to 1969, according to what little I could find. Its membership included representatives from major Christian denominations, Jewish religious authorities, and even some Islamic scholars. The council was supposedly formed to coordinate religious response to unusual phenomena in the post-war era. That was the official line anyway. The reality appeared to be much more specific. I found meeting minutes from 1958 that discussed the Collins Elite Presentation on Entity Communication Patterns. A 1960 report mentioned successful implementation of Collins Elite discernment protocols in 17 states. A 1962 memorandum warned of increased entity activity coinciding with popular UFO narratives. The council wasn't just studying religious phenomena in general, they were specifically focused on what they called entity encounters, and they were working directly with Collins Elite to develop responses. The most disturbing document I found was a 1961 report titled Spiritual Warfare in the Space Age. It outlined what the Council believed to be a deliberate deception campaign by non-human entities. Historical analysis suggests consistent behavioural patterns across millennia. Entities appearing as divine beings in ancient times demanded worship, sacrifice, and absolute obedience. Modern manifestations as space visitors request trust, cooperation, and technological exchange. The underlying objective, human subjugation, remains unchanged. The report went on to detail specific cases where UFO contactees had reported entities claiming to be from various star systems, but whose messages contained elements identical to ancient religious texts describing demonic deception. According to the Council's analysis, the entities were running the same con they'd always run. They just updated their costumes for each era. As I dug deeper into the Council's documents, I started to notice something unsettling. My research wasn't going unnoticed. It started small. Dr. Martinelli mentioned that someone had been asking about my work. Just routine monitoring, he said, but he looked uncomfortable about it. Then I noticed that some of the documents I'd photographed were being moved to different sections of the archive. Files that had been easily accessible suddenly required special permission to view. The final warning came on a Tuesday night in November. I was alone in the archive basement scanning a particularly interesting 1963 document about Collins Elite Field Operations, when my computer screen flickered. The document disappeared, replaced by a simple text message. "Stop looking, they're not what you think." I stared at the screen, heart pounding. Someone was monitoring my research in real time. Someone with access to the university's network, and probably a lot more than that. I should have stopped then. Any reasonable person would have backed off, found a different job, maybe moved to a different city. But I wasn't reasonable anymore. I was obsessed. And besides, whoever was watching had just confirmed that I was onto something real. I replied by typing into the same text box that had appeared on my screen. "Then what are they?" The response came immediately. "They've worn every mask we've ever worshipped." The screen flickered again and the message disappeared. But the implication was crystal clear. Collins Elite wasn't just studying UFO entities. They'd concluded that these entities were the same beings that had manipulated human religious belief throughout history. Ancient gods, modern aliens, same entities, different costumes. After the warning, access to documents became nearly impossible. Files went missing. Archives were suddenly under renovation. Dr. Martinelli stopped returning my emails. It was clear that my research had triggered some kind of response from whoever wanted Collins Elite to remain buried. But I'd already seen enough to piece together the broad outline of their doctrine. Collins Elite appeared to be a small classified unit within the US government that approached the UFO phenomenon from a religious rather than scientific perspective. Based on the scattered evidence I'd found, their core beliefs seemed to be UFO entities were not extraterrestrial visitors. They were the same non-corporeal beings that had interacted with humans throughout history. These entities had consistently masqueraded as whatever humans were most likely to worship or trust. Their ultimate goal was the spiritual subjugation of humanity. The modern UFO phenomenon was simply their latest deception campaign. The unit apparently worked closely with religious leaders to develop protocols for identifying and resisting entity influence. They studied religious texts not for historical interest, but for tactical intelligence about entity behaviour patterns. They viewed exorcists and clergy as frontline personnel in a spiritual war that most people didn't even know was happening. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to believe they were losing. My research into Collins Elite had taken nearly 6 months, and by December I was running out of leads. The documents had dried up, my access was severely restricted, and I was starting to wonder if I'd ever find anything more concrete than footnotes and oblique references. That's when I decided to look at modern UFO phenomena through the Collins Elite lens. What I found was terrifying in its consistency. Contemporary UFO contactee reports, when examined from a religious perspective, showed the same patterns that Collins Elite had apparently identified in the 1950s. Entities claiming to be from Zeta Reticuli or the Pleiades, but whose messages contained elements identical to ancient Gnostic texts. Space brothers, preaching salvation through technological advancement, using language that echoed Mesopotamian religious propaganda. Abduction experiences that followed the same psychological patterns as historical demonic possession cases. The modern UFO disclosure movement, viewed through Collins Elite's framework, looked less like a quest for scientific truth and more like the latest phase of an ancient deception campaign. Entities that had once demanded worship as gods now requested trust as benevolent aliens. Same control mechanisms, updated for a scientific age. I started to understand why Collins Elite had worked so closely with religious authorities. If you believe that UFO entities were actually spiritual beings with thousands of years of experience in manipulating human belief systems, then scientists and military analysts were the wrong people to study them. You needed theologians. You needed people who understood the long history of spiritual deception and the psychological mechanisms of faith. You needed people who could recognize the same lie being told with new words. I thought I'd reached the end of my research when I received an unexpected email in January. The sender was listed as archive.recovery@gmail.com, obviously a throwaway account. The message was brief. You've been asking the right questions. Room 847, basement level, manuscript collection. Look behind the Milton volumes. 1 hour only. I almost deleted it. Every instinct told me it was a trap, but the Collins Elite investigation had become an obsession, and I couldn't walk away from what might be my last chance at finding real answers. An hour later, I was in the basement of the manuscript collection, a building I'd never visited before. Room 847 was a cramped storage room filled with old books and filing cabinets. The Milton volumes were easy to find, a complete set of Paradise Lost editions dating back to the 1800s. Behind the books, taped to the back of the shelf, was a manila envelope. Inside was a single document that changed everything I thought I knew about Collins Elite. It was typed on official US government letterhead, dated August 12, 1969, and marked Eyes Only Collins Elite Termination Report. The document was brief but explosive. Memorandum for the record subject: termination of Collins Elite program. Effective immediately. All Collins Elite operations are suspended indefinitely. Program termination follows unanimous recommendation by Collins Elite senior staff. Reason for termination: successful entity infiltration of program hierarchy. Evidence suggests long-term entity influence over program direction since 1961. Collins Elite conclusions regarding entity nature remain valid. However, program itself has been compromised beyond recovery. All Collins Elite personnel are reassigned. All documents classified at highest levels. Religious community partnerships terminated. Interdenominational council dissolved. Public disclosure of Collins Elite findings is prohibited under national security provisions. Final assessment. The entities we sought to understand and counter have proven more sophisticated than anticipated. They have successfully used our own investigation against us, turning our knowledge into a tool for their agenda. The Collins Elite program has become part of the deception we were created to expose. Any future investigation of these phenomena must proceed under the assumption that traditional government and academic institutions are compromised. Minus Dr. Edward Collins, Program Director. I read the document 3 times before the implications sank in. Collins Elite hadn't just been terminated because of budget cuts or bureaucratic reshuffling. It had been terminated because the entities they were studying had infiltrated and co-opted the program itself. The Watchers had been turned into accomplices. And if that was true in 1969, what did it mean for every government UFO program since then? Sitting in that storage room, holding what might be the last authentic Collins Elite document ever created, I finally understood the true scope of what I'd uncovered. Collins Elite hadn't been a fringe program run by religious zealots. It had been a serious government investigation that reached a conclusion so disturbing that the entities being studied had been forced to destroy it. The program had gotten too close to the truth, so the truth had destroyed the program. But what was that truth? Based on everything I'd found, Collins Elite had concluded that the UFO phenomenon was not extraterrestrial contact, but rather the latest phase of an ancient psychological operation. Non-corporeal entities, call them demons, call them interdimensional beings, call them whatever you want, had been manipulating human belief systems for millennia. They had appeared as gods to ancient peoples, demanding worship and sacrifice. They had manifested as angels and devils to medieval societies, shaping religious doctrine. And now they were appearing as alien visitors to a technological civilization, promoting their agenda through the language of science and space exploration. The genius of it was that each generation thought they were encountering something new. Ancient peoples saw divine visitation, medieval believers saw spiritual manifestation, modern witnesses see extraterrestrial contact. But according to Collins Elite, it was always the same entities, always running the same basic deception, always working toward the same goal, the spiritual and psychological subjugation of humanity. The entities had realized that direct worship was no longer feasible in a scientific age, so they had adapted, presenting themselves as technologically advanced aliens who could offer humanity salvation through scientific advancement. Instead of demanding worship, they requested trust. Instead of requiring sacrifice, they asked for cooperation. But the underlying dynamic remained the same, humans giving up their autonomy to beings who claimed to have their best interests at heart. And if Collins Elite was right, the modern UFO disclosure movement was simply the latest phase of this deception campaign. The termination document explained why I'd never heard of Collins Elite in any mainstream UFO research. It wasn't being covered up by the government to hide alien contact. It was being covered up because the government itself had been compromised by the entities Collins Elite was studying. Think about it. Every major government UFO program since Collins Elite, Project Blue Book, AA-TIP, the UAP Task Force, had approached the phenomenon from a purely technological perspective. They studied craft capabilities, flight patterns, potential propulsion systems. They never asked the questions Collins Elite had been asking. What do these entities actually want? Why do their messages always promote dependence rather than independence? Why do their promises of enlightenment always require surrender of human agency? Those questions weren't being ignored by accident. According to the termination document, they were being actively suppressed by entities who had learned to work within government and academic institutions. The modern UFO research community, the disclosure advocates, the scientists studying anomalous aerial phenomena, they might all be sincere in their efforts, but they were asking the wrong questions. They were looking for extraterrestrial contact when they should have been looking for spiritual deception. And that meant that every major UFO revelation of the past 50 years might actually be part of the deception Collins Elite had tried to expose. I left that storage room with more questions than answers, but one thing was crystal clear. Collins Elite had tried to warn us, and we hadn't listened. Worse, we might not be capable of listening because the entities they warned us about had apparently learned to control the conversation. Over the following weeks, I tried to verify the termination document through official channels. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests. I contacted government historians. I reached out to former intelligence officials. The responses were universally the same. No record of any program called Collins Elite existed in official government files. But that didn't mean the program had never existed. It just meant that someone had been very thorough in erasing it. The more I thought about it, the more the Collins Elite scenario made sense of things that had always bothered me about the UFO phenomenon. Why did entity messages always promote technological dependence rather than spiritual development? Why did alien contact always require humans to abandon their traditional belief systems? Why did every promised revelation turn out to be just another layer of mystery? According to Collins Elite, it was because the entities weren't trying to enlighten us. They were trying to control us. And the best way to control a technologically advanced species was to convince them that salvation could only come through higher technology, provided by beings who claimed to have humanity's best interests at heart. The ancient formula, updated for a scientific age. After finding the termination document, I thought my Collins Elite investigation was over, but 2 weeks later, I received another cryptic email from the same archive. Recovery account. You found the termination report. Good. Now find the real archive. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, Georgetown University Theology Department. Tell her Marcus sent you. I almost ignored it. The rational part of my brain was screaming that I was already in too deep, that whoever was feeding me information might be leading me into something dangerous. But the name Marcus rang a bell. Marcus Whitmore, the author of that first 1963 thesis, where I'd found the Collins Elite reference. Could he still be alive? Dr. Rodriguez's office was in a converted Victorian house on the Georgetown campus, tucked between the main theology building and an old chapel. When I mentioned that Marcus had sent me, her reaction was immediate and alarming. She locked her office door, closed the blinds, and pulled out a device I later learned was a radio frequency detector. 62 years, she said quietly, sweeping the device around the room. 62 years Marcus has been waiting for someone to follow the trail far enough to find him. He's 91 years old and still afraid they're listening. Dr. Rodriguez led me through a maze of basement corridors beneath the theology building to a climate-controlled storage room I never could have found on my own. Inside, Marcus Whitmore sat surrounded by filing cabinets that looked like they'd been moved there decades ago. He was ancient, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "You're the one asking about Collins Elite," he said. It wasn't a question. "Eleanor tells me you found the termination report. That means they decided you were ready." "They?" "The survivors. The ones who got out before the infiltration was complete." He gestured to the filing cabinets around us. "We've been maintaining our own archive for over 50 years. Everything the government tried to bury, we preserved. What Marcus showed me over the next 6 hours changed everything I thought I knew about Collins Elite, and about the scope of the deception they had uncovered. Collins Elite hadn't begun as a government program at all. It had started in 1947 as an informal network of military officers, intelligence analysts and religious scholars who were disturbed by early UFO reports. What bothered them wasn't the craft themselves, but the messages being delivered by the entities inside them. The contactee movement was just getting started, Marcus explained, pulling out files from the late 1940s. George Adamski, Daniel Fry, Truman Bethurum, all these people claiming contact with benevolent space brothers. But when you analysed their messages from a theological perspective, they weren't promoting human spiritual development. They were promoting dependence. The early Collins Elite had conducted detailed analyses of contactee messages and found disturbing patterns. The entities consistently promoted several key themes: the inadequacy of human religion, the necessity of technological advancement, the benefits of surrendering human decision-making to superior beings, and the dangers of independent spiritual development. It was the same psychological framework used by every cult in history, Dr. Rodriguez added. Isolate the subject from their support systems, convince them that traditional sources of guidance are inadequate, then position yourself as the only reliable source of truth. But Collins Elite's analysis went deeper than simple cult mechanics. They had identified specific linguistic and conceptual patterns that appeared across different contactee cases, patterns that matched historical accounts of demonic deception dating back thousands of years. Marcus showed me a 1952 analysis comparing Adamski's alleged conversations with Venusian beings to transcripts from 16th century witch trials. The parallels were undeniable. The same promises of secret knowledge, the same dismissal of conventional morality, the same emphasis on the chosen status of the contactee. That's when we knew we were dealing with something ancient, Marcus said. These weren't aliens from space. They were the same entities that had been manipulating human belief systems since the beginning of recorded history. By 1957, Collins Elite had attracted official government attention. The CIA and military intelligence was struggling to understand the UFO phenomenon from a technological perspective, but Collins Elite was approaching it from an entirely different angle and getting results. We could predict contactee behaviour patterns, Dr. Rodriguez explained. We could identify which cases were likely to be genuine entity contact versus hoaxes or psychological episodes. We could even predict what messages the entities would deliver in future contacts. This predictive ability had made Collins Elite invaluable to government agencies dealing with UFO incidents. But it had also made them a target. Marcus pulled out a thick file labelled Entity Response Patterns, 1958 to 1961. Inside were dozens of reports documenting how UFO activity and contactee experiences changed in response to Collins Elite investigations. Whenever we got too close to exposing their methods, they would shift tactics, Marcus said. Study their linguistic patterns too closely, and suddenly contactees would start receiving messages in completely different styles. Document their technological claims, and they would start demonstrating entirely different capabilities. The entities weren't just running a deception campaign, they were actively monitoring the investigators and adapting their approach in real time. But the most disturbing pattern was personal targeting. Collins Elite members began experiencing their own anomalous encounters, but these experiences were clearly designed to discredit or manipulate the investigators, rather than provide genuine contact. Dr. Edward Collins himself was contacted in 1960, Marcus revealed. The entity claimed to be from Rigel and offered to provide him with advanced technology in exchange for shutting down the Collins Elite program. When he refused, the encounters became increasingly threatening. Other Collins Elite members reported similar experiences, contact attempts that seemed designed to either co-opt them or drive them out of the program entirely. The entities were fighting back. The termination document I'd found told only part of the story. The real disaster began in 1961 when Collins Elite was formally incorporated into the government's UFO investigation apparatus. That was our mistake, Marcus said bitterly. We thought official recognition would give us more resources, better access to witness testimony, protection from entity retaliation. Instead, it gave them access to us. With official status came new personnel assignments, government oversight, and integration with other classified programs. Collins Elite's small, tight-knit network of trusted researchers was suddenly flooded with new members whose backgrounds couldn't be thoroughly vetted. The infiltration was subtle at first, Dr. Rodriguez explained. New analysts who would subtly shift the focus of investigations, administrative personnel who would lose crucial documents, supervisors who would redirect resources toward more promising lines of inquiry. By 1965, original Collins Elite members were reporting that their research conclusions were being systematically altered before reaching higher-level officials. Analyses emphasizing the deceptive nature of entity contact were being rewritten to focus on potential technological benefits. Warnings about spiritual manipulation were being deleted entirely. Marcus showed me internal memos from 1966 to 1968, documenting the growing suspicion among original Collins Elite members that their program had been compromised. They began conducting parallel investigations using secure channels, trying to determine whether the infiltration was the result of foreign intelligence operations, bureaucratic incompetence, or something more sinister. By 1968, We had our answer, Marcus said grimly. It was the entities themselves. They had learned to work through human intermediaries, people who might not even be consciously aware that they were being influenced. The evidence was subtle but damning. New Collins elite personnel consistently made decisions that served entity interests, redirecting investigations away from deception analysis, promoting contactees who delivered pro-entity messages, suppressing research that exposed manipulation tactics. The final proof came when Dr. Collins tried to present his findings to the Defense Intelligence Agency in 1969, Dr. Rodriguez said. His presentation was completely rewritten between the time he submitted it and the time it was delivered. Instead of warning about entity deception, it recommended increased cooperation with UFO intelligences. That was when the original Collins elite members realized their program had been completely subverted. The Watchers had become the watched, and the watched had become the watchers. Rather than fight a battle they couldn't win within government channels, the original Collins elite members made a radical decision. They would fake the program's termination while secretly continuing their research through private channels. The termination report you found was genuine, Marcus explained, but it wasn't the end of Collins elite. It was the beginning of the real investigation. Using their existing contacts within religious institutions, academia and government, the Collins elite survivors established a covert network for continuing their research. They couldn't publish their findings or seek official recognition, but they could continue gathering evidence and developing their understanding of the entity deception campaign. We've been operating continuously for over 50 years, Dr. Rodriguez said, documenting entity activity, analysing their evolving strategies, tracking their infiltration of various institutions. The underground Collins elite had identified several key developments since 1969. The entities had largely abandoned individual contactee operations in favour of influencing institutions directly. Rather than delivering messages through isolated individuals who could be easily dismissed, they were now working through respected scientists, government officials and religious leaders. They had also shifted their primary narrative from spiritual enlightenment to technological salvation. Instead of promising cosmic consciousness or spiritual advancement, they were now focusing on environmental solutions, clean energy, and space exploration. Most significantly, they had begun preparing for mass disclosure rather than gradual revelation. The underground Collins elite believed this represented the final phase of a deception campaign that had been in development for decades. Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez walked me through 50 years of documented entity influence on human institutions. The pattern was consistent but sophisticated. Entities never directly controlled human behaviour, but they influenced it through carefully orchestrated synchronicities, technological inspirations, and strategic information releases. Look at the development of computer technology, Dr. Rodriguez said, showing me files documenting unusual technological leaps in electronics and computing since the 1960s. Every major breakthrough happened shortly after UFO encounters involving personnel who were in positions to influence research directions. The entities weren't providing blueprints or direct technological assistance. Instead, they were inspiring specific lines of research, guiding human scientists toward discoveries that served long-term entity interests. The internet, social media, artificial intelligence, all of these technologies have made humanity more connected but also more controllable, Marcus observed. They've created systems that can monitor and influence human behaviour on a global scale. According to underground Collins elite analysis, the entities had been systematically encouraging the development of technologies that would make mass psychological manipulation easier, while simultaneously making individual privacy and independence more difficult. But the most disturbing revelation was their analysis of the modern UFO disclosure movement itself. Every major disclosure advocate, every government whistleblower, every scientist calling for serious UFO research, we've documented anomalous encounters in their backgrounds, Dr. Rodriguez said. They're not consciously working for the entities, but they're all promoting the same basic narrative, that UFO contact is inevitable, beneficial, and should be embraced rather than resisted. The underground Collins elite had identified specific psychological themes being promoted through disclosure advocates: the inadequacy of human civilization, the necessity of outside intervention, the benefits of technological advancement over spiritual development, and the dangers of resistance to contact. It's the same message the contactees were delivering in the 1950s, Marcus said, just delivered through more credible sources and backed by more sophisticated evidence. According to the Underground Collins Elite's analysis, the current disclosure campaign was preparation for something unprecedented, open entity contact with humanity as a whole, rather than selected individuals. They've spent 70 years testing human responses, refining their approach, identifying the most effective manipulation strategies, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Now they're ready to scale up. The evidence they showed me was circumstantial but compelling. Government UFO programs consistently focused on technological aspects while ignoring behavioral and psychological elements. Scientific studies of anomalous phenomena emphasized physical measurements while dismissing witness testimony about entity motivations. Media coverage promoted wonder and excitement about potential contact while discouraging analysis of entity intentions. They're engineering consent, Marcus said, creating a cultural context where open contact will be seen as humanity's graduation to a higher level of existence rather than submission to a superior intelligence. The Underground Collins elite believed that formal contact would be presented as humanity's invitation to join a galactic community, with entities offering technological solutions to environmental problems, social conflicts, and resource limitations. The offer would seem generous, beneficial, and desperately needed. But according to their analysis, acceptance would come with costs that wouldn't become apparent until it was too late. The gradual replacement of human decision-making systems with entity-guided alternatives, the erosion of individual agency in favour of collective efficiency, and the redefinition of human spiritual development to align with entity objectives. It won't feel like conquest, Dr. Rodriguez said. It will feel like salvation, right up until the moment humans realise they've traded their freedom for security, and they're no longer capable of making that trade in reverse. After hours of reviewing evidence and analysis, I asked the obvious question. If the Underground Collins elite was right about entity intentions, what could be done to counter them? Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez exchanged glances before Marcus answered carefully. Individual resistance is possible but difficult, he said. The entities rely on collective consent and institutional cooperation. They can't force contact on humans who genuinely reject it, but they can make such rejection seem irrational, antisocial, or harmful. The Underground Collins elite had developed what they called spiritual inoculation, techniques for recognizing and resisting entity influence. These included traditional religious practices like prayer and meditation, but also more analytical approaches, questioning the source and motivation behind any message promoting dependence, examining whether proposed solutions increased or decreased human agency, and maintaining strong connections to human community and traditional wisdom. The entities are masters of isolation and dependency, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Their influence is weakest when humans are connected to each other and to their own spiritual traditions, and strongest when individuals feel cut off from community and traditional sources of guidance. But individual resistance wouldn't be enough if the entities succeeded in achieving mass consent for contact. The Underground Collins elite believed that their most important function was preserving and disseminating knowledge about entity deception methods, so that future generations would have the tools needed to recognize and resist manipulation. That's why we've maintained this archive, Marcus said, and why we're sharing it with you now. The disclosure campaign is accelerating, and we may not have much time left to prepare people for what's coming. As I write this, the UFO disclosure movement is reaching a crescendo. Government officials are admitting that anomalous aerial phenomena are real. Military personnel are testifying about encounters with craft displaying impossible capabilities. Scientists are calling for serious study of the phenomenon. The public is being prepared for some kind of revelation. But if Collins' elite was right, that revelation might be the culmination of a deception campaign that began thousands of years ago. Think about how perfectly the current disclosure narrative fits the Collins elite framework. We're being told that non-human intelligence has been monitoring humanity, that these beings possess technology, that could solve our energy and environmental problems, that contact is inevitable and potentially beneficial. We're being encouraged to view disclosure as a positive development, a step forward in human evolution. But what if it's actually the final step in a plan that began when the first human looked at the sky and wondered if the gods were watching? The entities Collins' elite studied had thousands of years to perfect their understanding of human psychology. They knew that direct domination would eventually fail, that humans would rebel against obvious tyranny, but they also knew that humans could be convinced to surrender their autonomy willingly, if the surrender was framed as enlightenment or advancement. The promise of godhood had worked for ancient peoples. The promise of salvation had worked for medieval societies. And the promise of technological transcendence might be working on us right now. Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez had given me a framework for understanding the entity deception campaign, but they also gave me something more practical. A list of specific indicators that the final phase was beginning. We've been tracking these markers for decades, Dr. Rodriguez explained, showing me a comprehensive timeline of predicted developments. When all of them align, it means the entities believe humanity is ready for open contact. The first indicator was mainstream media normalization of UFO phenomena, not just reporting on UFO incidents, but actively promoting the idea that contact would be beneficial. According to their analysis, this phase had begun in earnest around 2017 and was accelerating rapidly. The second indicator was government disclosure of UAP reality without disclosure of government conclusions about entity intentions. They're admitting the phenomena are real, while carefully avoiding any discussion of what the entities actually want, Marcus noted. This creates public curiosity without public wariness. The third indicator was increased entity activity designed to demonstrate technological superiority while maintaining plausible deniability. The recent UAP videos released by the Pentagon fit this pattern perfectly. Clear evidence of advanced technology, but no direct communication or obvious threat. The fourth indicator was the emergence of credible advocates for contact within scientific, military, and government institutions. People with impressive credentials and no obvious ulterior motives, all promoting the same basic message: that humanity should welcome contact rather than fear it. Look at the current disclosure advocates, Dr. Rodriguez said, showing me biographical information on various scientists and former government officials. Impressive backgrounds, sincere motivations, reasonable arguments, but they're all promoting the same narrative the entities have been pushing for 70 years. The fifth and most disturbing indicator was the systematic suppression of research into entity psychology and motivations. While technological aspects of UAP were receiving increased attention and funding, questions about entity intentions were being dismissed as unscientific or irrelevant. That's how you know the entities are controlling the conversation, Marcus said. Any investigation that might reveal their true agenda gets discredited or defunded, while investigations that support their preferred narrative receive institutional support. According to their tracking system, all 5 indicators were currently active and accelerating. The underground Collins elite believed this meant humanity was within years, possibly months, of formal entity contact. Before I left Georgetown that day, Marcus pulled me aside for a private conversation. "You need to understand what you're walking into," he said quietly. "Everyone who's gotten this deep into Collins elite research has faced the same choice. Drop the investigation or accept that your life is going to change in ways you can't predict or control." He told me about colleagues who had been discredited through carefully orchestrated academic scandals, researchers who had lost funding after questioning entity motivations, investigators who had experienced personal crises that conveniently redirected their attention away from UFO phenomena. The entities don't usually resort to direct intimidation, Marcus explained. It's much more effective to make resistance seem personally costly. Failed relationships, career setbacks, health problems, family conflicts, all timed to coincide with getting too close to the truth. He showed me files documenting the life trajectories of dozens of Collins elite researchers over the past 50 years. The pattern was consistent. People who backed away from the investigation generally experienced improved circumstances, while those who continued faced escalating personal difficulties. "I'm not trying to scare you off," Marcus said. But you need to know that this isn't just an intellectual exercise. The entities have a vested interest in controlling what humans believe about them, and they've had centuries to develop sophisticated methods for managing troublesome individuals. Dr. Rodriguez had faced similar pressures. Her tenure at Georgetown had been threatened twice due to budget constraints that mysteriously resolved themselves when she temporarily reduced her Collins elite research. Her marriage had ended during a period of intensive investigation into entity influence on religious institutions. Her health had suffered during the years she was most actively documenting entity deception patterns. But here's the thing, she said. The difficulties are real, but they're not insurmountable. The entities can make resistance costly, but they can't make it impossible. If they could simply eliminate troublesome humans, Collins Elite would never have existed in the first place. She believed that entity limitations were precisely why the deception campaign was necessary. If entities could control human behavior directly, they wouldn't need to spend decades engineering consent for contact. The fact that they relied on manipulation suggested that human free will, while vulnerable to influence, remained fundamentally intact. Over the following months, Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez introduced me to other members of the underground Collins Elite network. I was amazed by both the size and diversity of the group. Theologians and physicists, former intelligence analysts and current religious leaders, retired military officers and active researchers. What united them wasn't a shared background or ideology, but a shared conclusion that the UFO phenomenon represented a spiritual threat masquerading as a technological opportunity. Father Michael Torres, a Catholic exorcist based in New Mexico, had been documenting parallels between UFO encounters and demonic possession for 30 years. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, a psychiatrist specializing in religious experiences, had identified specific psychological patterns linking modern abduction accounts to historical accounts of spiritual deception. Colonel James Patterson, retired, former Air Force intelligence, had spent decades analyzing UFO incident reports and concluded that entity behavior was consistent with psychological warfare rather than scientific exploration. Each member of the network brought specialized knowledge and perspective, but all had reached similar conclusions about entity motivations and methods. More importantly, all had experienced some form of pressure or retaliation for their research, confirming the underground Collins Elite's assessment that entity influence extended far beyond individual contactee cases. We're not conspiracy theorists, Dr. Walsh explained during one of our meetings. We're researchers who followed the evidence to an uncomfortable conclusion. The UFO phenomenon is real, the entities are real, but their intentions aren't what they claim to be. The network had developed sophisticated methods for secure communication and information sharing, operating on the assumption that their activities were being monitored by both government agencies and entity-influenced individuals within those agencies. We have to assume that any information we share through normal channels will be compromised, Colonel Patterson explained. But we also can't become so paranoid that we stop sharing information entirely. The entities benefit from our isolation more than our communication. As my involvement with the underground Collins Elite deepened, I learned that the network extended far beyond the United States. Religious leaders in Europe, researchers in Asia, indigenous spiritual authorities in South America, all were reporting similar observations about entity activity and deception patterns. Dr. Rodriguez arranged for me to speak with several international contacts via encrypted communication channels. Their perspectives added crucial context to the Collins Elite analysis. Brother Antonio Mendez, a Spanish monk who specialized in mystical theology, had been tracking entity influences on contemporary religious movements. His research suggested that entities were actively promoting syncretistic spiritual practices that emphasized cosmic consciousness over traditional religious authority. They're not attacking religion directly, he explained through a translator. They're subtly altering it, encouraging beliefs and practices that make humans more receptive to entity guidance and less connected to traditional sources of spiritual wisdom. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a Japanese researcher studying anomalous phenomena in Buddhist contexts, had identified similar patterns in Asian spiritual communities. Entity influences seem designed to promote meditation practices that open practitioners to external guidance, while discouraging those that strengthened individual discernment and spiritual independence. Maria Santos, a shaman from Peru, described entity encounters that closely paralleled North American UFO contact reports, but framed in terms of traditional indigenous spirituality. The entities consistently promoted abandonment of ancestral traditions in favour of updated spiritual practices more suitable for the modern world. Same spirits, different masks, she said simply. They tell each culture what that culture wants to hear, but always with the same goal: make humans depend on them instead of their own traditions and wisdom. The global perspective confirmed the underground Collins elite's assessment that entity activity was coordinated across cultures and belief systems, but adapted to local contexts and expectations. The deception campaign wasn't centered in any particular country or religion. It was targeting human spiritual independence as a universal phenomenon. Based on decades of analysis and current trends, the underground Collins elite had developed a timeline for what they believed would be the final phase of the entity deception campaign. Phase 1, 2020 to 2025, mainstream normalization of UFO phenomena through government disclosure and media coverage. Emphasis on technological aspects while avoiding discussion of entity psychology or motivations. Gradual preparation of public consciousness for the possibility of contact. Phase 2, 2025 to 2030. Increased entity demonstrations designed to showcase technological capabilities and benevolent intentions, possibly including solutions to environmental or energy crises that humanity appears unable to solve independently. Growing public pressure for government contact initiatives. Phase 3, 2030 to 2035, formal contact between entity representatives and human governments. Presentation of comprehensive assistance packages addressing climate change, resource depletion, social conflicts and technological limitations. Initial agreements for limited cooperation and information exchange. Phase 4, 2035 to 2040. Gradual integration of entity guidance into human decision-making systems. Replacement of traditional political, economic and social structures with entity-recommended alternatives. Growing human dependence on entity technology and advice. Phase 5, 2040 plus. Complete transformation of human civilization according to entity specifications. Elimination of independent human spiritual development in favour of entity-directed consciousness evolution. Humanity's transition from independent species to managed resource. The genius of the timeline is that each phase will seem like humanity's choice, Dr. Rodriguez explained. People will vote for leaders who support contact. They'll demand access to entity technology. They'll embrace changes that make their lives easier and more comfortable. Marcus nodded grimly. By the time humans realize they've traded their freedom for security, the infrastructure for independence will have been dismantled. They'll be completely dependent on systems they don't understand, controlled by entities they trusted. The timeline wasn't inevitable, according to Underground Collins' elite analysis, but it was highly probable unless humanity developed widespread awareness of entity deception methods and conscious resistance to manipulation. That's why we're talking to you, Marcus said, and why we've been talking to researchers like you for 50 years. Information is the only weapon we have against this kind of psychological operation. After months of research and analysis, I found myself facing the same choice that every Collins elite researcher had faced since 1947. Accept the implications of what I'd learned, or find a way to dismiss it as paranoid speculation. The evidence was circumstantial but extensive. The pattern was consistent but complex. The implications were staggering but difficult to prove conclusively, and the personal costs of continued investigation were becoming increasingly apparent. My freelance work had dried up mysteriously. Dr. Martinelli had stopped returning my calls after someone complained about my misuse of university resources. My relationship was suffering under the strain of long hours spent on research I couldn't fully explain. My sleep was disrupted by dreams that felt more like memories of conversations I'd never had. But I also couldn't ignore what I'd learned. If Collins' elite was even partially correct, then humanity was walking into the most sophisticated trap in recorded history. And if that trap succeeded, if Future generations would live in a world where human independence was not just restricted, but literally unthinkable. The choice, ultimately, was between personal comfort and collective responsibility, between individual security and species survival, between the easy path of accepting official narratives and the difficult path of questioning everything I thought I knew about humanity's place in the universe. I chose to continue the investigation. It's been 6 months since my first meeting with Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez, and I'm no longer the same person who stumbled across that footnote in a theological dissertation. The evidence I've gathered has convinced me that Collins' elite was not only real, but correct in their fundamental assessment of the UFO phenomenon. We are not being visited by benevolent space brothers seeking to help humanity evolve to a higher level of consciousness. We are being manipulated by entities that have been perfecting deception techniques for millennia, entities that view humanity as a resource to be managed rather than a species to be assisted. The current UFO disclosure movement, whatever the sincere intentions of its individual advocates, is serving entity interests by preparing humanity to welcome contact rather than question it. The technological solutions being offered through various contact scenarios are not gifts, but baits in an elaborate trap that will close once humanity becomes dependent on entity guidance. And the most terrifying aspect is that it's working exactly as planned. Public opinion is shifting in favour of contact. Government agencies are admitting UFO reality while avoiding UFO psychology. Scientific institutions are studying technological aspects while ignoring behavioural patterns. Religious leaders are embracing cosmic spirituality while abandoning traditional discernment practices. We are being prepared for our own subjugation, and we're enthusiastically participating in the preparation process. But knowledge of a deception campaign, even a sophisticated one, provides power to resist it. The entities Collins' elite studied were powerful and cunning, but they were not omnipotent. Their influence depended on human ignorance, isolation, and consent. When humans understood their methods and refused to cooperate, entity influence diminished significantly. The underground Collins elite has spent 50 years documenting entity weaknesses as well as their strengths. They've developed techniques for recognizing and resisting manipulation. They've maintained networks of communication and support that entity influence cannot completely penetrate, and most importantly, they've preserved knowledge that would otherwise have been lost or corrupted. That knowledge is now available to anyone willing to look for it, question official narratives, and think independently about humanity's future. The choice between freedom and security, between independence and dependence, between human agency and entity guidance remains open. But that choice won't remain open forever. According to every timeline the underground Collins elite has developed, we are rapidly approaching the point where collective consent for entity contact will make individual resistance increasingly difficult and ultimately ineffective. The time for choosing is now. The information needed to choose wisely exists, but it requires effort to find and courage to accept. The consequences of choosing poorly may be irreversible. 60 years ago, Collins' elite tried to warn us. Today, their successors are still trying. Whether humanity listens and whether we choose wisely remains to be seen. But the warning has been delivered. The evidence has been presented. The choice is ours. Maybe that's why you never hear their name in congressional hearings or disclosure reports, because Collins' elite wasn't warning us about aliens. They were warning us about faith in the wrong thing, and how easily it can damn us. The question isn't whether Collins' elite really existed. The question is whether they were right. And if they were right, then everything we think we know about the UFO phenomenon might be part of the very deception they tried to expose. The entities they described have had 60 years to perfect their strategy since Collins' elite was terminated. 60 years to learn how to work within our institutions, shape our research, and guide our conclusions. 60 years to make sure that when disclosure finally comes, we'll welcome it with open arms. Because that's what good servants do, they welcome their masters home. But servants can choose to be free. The question is whether they will make that choice while they still can. That's tonight's deep dive into the Collins elite. A story that challenges everything we think we know about the UFO phenomenon and asks uncomfortable questions about the nature of contact itself. What do you think? Was Collins' elite a real government program, or just an elaborate piece of disinformation? And either way, are the questions they were asking the ones we should be asking now? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to suggest topics for future episodes. Your ideas keep sleep theories going, and trust me, we've only scratched the surface of what's hidden in the footnotes of history. Until next time, sleep well and question everything.